My friend Emma had been working at her company for over 5 years, pouring herself into every project. She'd been eyeing a promotion, something her boss hinted at every time she took on more work. When they finally announced the new role, Emma was sure it was hers. She'd gone through rounds of interviews and presentations, putting in hours after work to prove she was the best fit. But when the day came, they gave the position to someone from outside the company, someone who hadn't put in half the work she had. "We just thought he'd bring a fresh perspective," her boss told her, all smiles. Emma was devastated. 5 years, and that's what I get," she said to me that night, trying to laugh but barely holding it together. Around the same time, my cousin Nate had his own battle. He's a massive sports fan, and he'd been saving up to take his dad to a playoff game as a surprise. But the tickets sold out within minutes, and when he checked resale sites, they were going for triple the price. "It's like they're playing with us," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "They know fans will pay anything, so they jack up the price just because they can." What was supposed to be a dream for him and his dad had turned into just another thing to scroll past, out of reach. Later that week, Emma and Nate and I ended up at a bar to blow off some steam. Emma was still simmering from her work letdown, Nate from the ticket fiasco, and me, I was just angry in general. It felt like every time we tried to make something happen, we'd get undercut by someone with more power or money, someone who barely even cared about the things we held close. "They set it up so the rules don't apply to them," Emma said, taking a sip of her drink. "They dangle things just out of reach, and we're the ones left jumping, hoping for scraps." As if on cue, Nate's phone buzzed with a news alert. It was about a new scandal involving politicians trading stocks based on inside information. He showed us the headline, his mouth a thin line. "These people make the rules," he said, almost whispering. "They know what laws will pass, which industries will tank, and they're making bank on it." We sat there, each of us quietly fuming. It felt like betrayal, like the people who were supposed to serve the public had found a way to serve only themselves. The conversation drifted to our phones, the constant little beeps and pings that felt like they were running our lives. Emma told us about a new app her company was rolling out, something designed to help with productivity. But she knew the truth. It was a tracking app, monitoring every keystroke, every pause, every moment of idleness. "They say it's for efficiency, but it feels like a leash," she said, looking almost ashamed. "Even our time isn't ours anymore." I thought about the apps I'd installed on my own phone, all the permissions I'd granted without a second thought. GPS, contacts, even my camera, all fair game for companies whose only interest was turning my data into profit. Then Nate mentioned the gambling ads he kept seeing everywhere, from his social media feed to random banner ads online. "They make it look like a quick win, like a fun escape," he said, frowning. He told us about his friend who'd fallen deep into online gambling, losing thousands of dollars within weeks. "It's just like those cigarette ads they used to have, except now they're legal and everywhere." Nate had seen firsthand how it could wreck lives, yet here it was being advertised like candy, with no warnings, no restrictions. As we walked out of the bar that night, we passed by a group of people with a police dog. The officers were stopping random people, asking to see IDs, making them empty their pockets. It was all so casual, like this display of authority was just another part of the scenery. When we were a safe distance away, Emma turned to us, shaking her head. "What happened to privacy? To respect?" She laughed bitterly. "Feels like everything we got is up for grabs. Our time, our money, our data, none of it's really ours." And she was right. There was this sinking feeling, like we were slowly being hollowed out by a world that valued profit over people, power over fairness. As I watched Emma and Nate walk off into the night, I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever change, or if we'd just keep dancing to a tune someone else was playing, hoping we'd get to keep even a little of what mattered. It was supposed to be just another night. I've been out late with some friends, grabbing a quick dinner after a long day. The streets were quiet as I drove home, the glow of streetlights casting a soft, orange hue over the empty roads. It was one of those nights that felt deceptively calm, like the world was letting you breathe a little easier. I had no reason to think anything unusual would happen, until I rounded the last turn onto my street and saw my neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, sitting on her porch in the middle of the night, a look of panic on her face. Mrs. Caldwell, was the type of person who was always in bed by 9 p.m. sharp. She was kind but kept to herself, mostly seen in her garden or out walking her little dog. Seeing her on the porch at this hour, wrapped in a robe and clutching her phone, was so out of place that I immediately parked and walked over, asking if everything was all right. Her hands shook as she clutched her phone, and she looked at me with a mix of fear and relief. "I think there's a gas leak," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd woken up to the faint smell of gas, something so subtle she almost dismissed it, chalking it up to her imagination or a neighbor's barbecue gone wrong. But the smell had grown stronger, and she had the sense to grab her phone and head outside, just in case. I knew enough about gas leaks to understand the danger. My own apartment had a gas stove, and I'd heard horror stories of leaks causing explosions, sometimes with little warning. I called the fire department while reassuring her, glancing back at her house with an anxious feeling gnawing at my stomach. The firefighters arrived in minutes, moving with quiet urgency, their faces serious. They checked her house thoroughly, and soon enough, they found the leak, a tiny crack in a gas line behind her stove. The firefighter in charge explained that it had likely been leaking for hours, building up a dangerous amount of gas in the confined space of her kitchen. Mrs. Caldwell sat on her porch, visibly shaken, realizing how close she'd come to a disaster. She kept thanking me for calling the firefighters, but I could only think about how lucky she'd been to notice that faint smell, to act on it instead of ignoring it. After they left, I walked back to my apartment, feeling an uneasy sense of vulnerability. I kept thinking about how easily things could go wrong, how Mrs. Caldwell had come so close to a catastrophe that could have wiped out half our building. It was a chilling reminder of the invisible threats we live with every day, the things we don't think about until they almost destroy us. Back in my apartment, I found myself pacing, unable to relax. My mind drifted to a similar close call I'd had years ago. I'd been staying with my cousin in his cramped New York apartment during a hot summer. The building was old, with rickety pipes and a questionable wiring system, but he assured me it was New York charm. One night, I woke up coughing, my throat and eyes burning. At first, I thought it was the summer heat getting to me, but then I realized there was smoke seeping into the room. Panicked, I woke my cousin, and we bolted out the door. We found the source quickly, a small electrical fire in the kitchen, sparked by an overloaded outlet. Thankfully, we managed to put it out before it spread, but the incident left me shaken. I couldn't shake the thought of how close we'd come, how a single spark could have ended so much more disastrously if we'd been just a little slower. Since then, I'd always been cautious about things like outlets and fire hazards. But seeing Mrs. Caldwell sitting there on her porch that night reminded me of how easily those dangers can creep up, even in the most ordinary places. We think our homes are safe, that we're protected by walls and routines, but in reality, it only takes a small crack, a tiny leak to upend everything. A few days after the gas leak scare, I noticed myself becoming hyper-aware of everything in my apartment. I'd unplugged appliances when I wasn't using them, checked my smoke and carbon monoxide detectors twice a day, and started looking up tips on fire safety. One evening, I found myself at a hardware store, buying a small fire extinguisher to keep in the kitchen, a purchase I never would have thought about before. As I stood in the checkout line, I felt a mix of embarrassment and reassurance. The small canister a quiet reminder that I was preparing for the things I hoped would never happen. It wasn't just about my apartment either. I started noticing the little things everywhere. The wobble in the railings on the subway, the loose tiles on the steps outside my building, even the dripping faucet in my bathroom. Each one of these things felt like a potential hazard, a small reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control if we ignore them. One night, as I was cooking dinner, the pot started boiling over, and I reflexively turned to grab the handle to move it off the burner. But something stopped me. The memory of a story a friend had told me about someone who'd grabbed a pot handle in the middle of a boil-over, spilling scalding water over their arm and suffering serious burns. I took a breath, turned off the stove, and carefully used a towel to move the pot instead, feeling both silly and strangely proud of myself for taking the extra precaution. Living with this new awareness was uncomfortable at first, like I was suddenly surrounded by hazards that only I could see. But over time, it became second nature. I learned to take my time, to check things twice, to listen to the small instincts that tell us when something feels off. A few weeks later, I ran into Mrs. Caldwell again. She looked well, a slight spring in her step as she walked her dog. She thanked me again for helping her that night, mentioning that she'd gotten her entire gas system replaced, along with some updated safety features around the house. I told her I'd taken some of the same precautions myself, laughing about my new obsession with safety checks. She smiled knowingly and said, "We only get these reminders once in a while. It's a good thing to pay attention to them." Her words stayed with me, a simple reminder that we can never be too careful with the spaces we inhabit, the places we call home. We're surrounded by small risks, some of them as invisible as a gas leak, as unassuming as a loose wire or an overloaded outlet. And maybe most of the time, nothing will come of them. But I realize that a little caution, a little vigilance, isn't just about avoiding disaster. It's about respecting the unpredictable nature of the world, acknowledging that we're all just a heartbeat away from danger, and choosing to protect ourselves and each other as best as we can. I'm not sure who I'm writing this for, or if it'll even make a difference, but maybe getting it down will help. I've barely slept in days, and every time I close my eyes, I see it, feel it like it's right there waiting for me to slip up, to drift off. It started when I was hired to house sit for a family in an upscale neighborhood. They were going on a long trip and wanted someone to stay there every night just to keep the place secure. The pay was decent, and I didn't have much going on, so I agreed. I showed up the night before they left, and they walked me through the place. 3 stories, sprawling rooms, fancy furniture, and this strange, almost sterile silence that felt heavy, even with them still there. But the weirdest part was the basement. When we got to the basement door, they stopped. The husband, Rick, glanced at his wife, and then looked back at me with this serious expression. "There's no need to go down there," he said. "It's just storage and some stuff we're renovating. The door locks automatically, so don't worry about it." I didn't think much of it at the time. Rich people always have these little quirks, right? But his tone stuck with me. I nodded, assuring them I'd steer clear, and they seemed relieved. That first night was peaceful, and I settled into the guest room with a good book, feeling lucky to have such an easy gig. The house was too quiet, though. You could hear every creak and groan, and sometimes it almost sounded like footsteps, like someone was just out of sight, shifting their weight on the old floorboards. But I told myself it was just my nerves, just a big, empty house playing tricks. It wasn't until the second night that things started happening. Around midnight, I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom across the hall from my bedroom when I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the hall. I stepped out, still holding my toothbrush, and listened. It sounded like something dragging along the floor, slow and heavy. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe a vent or the old pipes. I went back to bed, ignoring the sounds, determined to sleep through whatever creepy house noises were waiting for me. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud thud. I sat up, disoriented, and listened. The house was silent again, but something felt wrong, like the air was thicker, pressing down on me. I got up, half awake, and wandered through the house, checking doors and windows, but everything was locked. I was heading back to bed when I saw it, the basement door, hanging open just a crack. I froze, staring at it, trying to remember if I'd locked it. I was sure I had. The family had emphasized that the basement stayed locked, that I shouldn't go down there. But now the door was open, just wide enough for a person to slip through. I closed it carefully, making sure it latched, and headed back to bed, trying to shake off the unease settling over me. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that same faint scraping just below me, echoing up through the floorboards. The third night, things escalated. I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a movie when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. This time, I felt a chill run down my spine. I paused the movie, straining to hear. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs from the basement. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the steps were too clear, too steady. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and slowly crept toward the hallway. I could see the edge of the basement door from where I was standing, and it was wide open now, swinging slightly, as if someone had just gone through it. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, asking if anyone was there. Silence. But I could feel something watching me, a prickling awareness that made my skin crawl. I backed away, my mind racing, and then, out of nowhere, I heard a whisper, a low, raspy voice from the darkness beyond the door. "Come down." My blood ran cold. I knew I should call the police, get out of there, do something, but I was frozen in place, every nerve screaming at me not to turn my back on that door. Slowly, I backed away until I reached the stairs, never taking my eyes off the basement entrance. I went up to the guest room, shut the door, and locked it, breathing hard. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, clutching my phone, jumping at every tiny sound. Around dawn, when the house was finally filled with light, I crept back downstairs to check the basement door. It was closed and locked like nothing had ever happened. I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, that my mind was just playing tricks. But then the final night came. I'd made up my mind to stay awake, figuring I could last until morning and then leave, never come back. I was sitting on the couch, eyes locked on the basement door, trying to stay alert when the power went out. 1 second, I was sitting in the dim glow of the living room lamp. The next, I was plunged into pitch blackness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and that's when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the hallway, right in front of the basement door. It was tall, its form barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out its shape, the way it was just standing there, perfectly still, facing me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. I tried to back away, but my body felt frozen, like it was pinning me there with nothing but its stare. And then, slowly, it took a step forward, and I heard that same voice, low and twisted, as if it were coming from deep within the walls themselves. "I told you to come down." I backed up, tripping over the coffee table, scrambling to get to my feet. The figure moved closer, its face still shrouded in darkness, but its voice was getting louder, angrier. "You didn't listen." I turned and ran, bursting through the front door and into the night, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I didn't look back, didn't care if anyone saw me sprinting away like a madman. I drove home, left a message for the family, saying I couldn't continue, and blocked their number. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I was alone, I felt that same prickling on the back of my neck, like eyes boring into me from just beyond my sight. A week later, I was packing up my things, ready to move to a new apartment, when I found something that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of my suitcase, tucked beneath a pile of clothes, was a small, crumpled note. I hadn't put it there, hadn't seen it before, but as I unfolded it, I recognized the handwriting. "Next time, listen." And on the back, scribbled in the same dark ink, was a single word: "Downstairs." I haven't stayed alone at night since, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I still hear that voice, whispering my name from somewhere deep below, calling me to come down. I'm an ER doctor, and most nights, I see things that make people shudder just hearing about them. That's just the nature of this job. You don't end up working trauma if you can't stomach blood, broken bones, the worst kinds of pain. But no amount of training prepares you for the moments that really get to you, the ones that hit something deep inside. This story happened on a night like any other. It was just after midnight, the usual crowd of injuries trickling in, sprained ankles, broken arms, the occasional overdose. Then I got a page from the nurses at the front desk. They had a young woman, early 20s, who had just walked into the ER on her own. She looked rough, pale, shaky, eyes wide and unfocused. The nurse told me she seemed off in a way she couldn't quite explain. "There's something wrong with her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When I went out to the waiting area, the woman was sitting in a corner, clutching her stomach and rocking back and forth. Her clothes were disheveled, and she had dried blood on her hands. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, as if she hadn't slept in days. When I asked what had happened, she just shook her head, whispering, "I don't know. I don't know." We brought her back to an exam room, and as I checked her vitals, she started talking, her voice low and shaky. She told me she'd been driving home from a weekend out of town, somewhere in the mountains, when she'd taken a wrong turn. Her GPS had died, and she'd gotten lost on some back road, miles from any main highway. She said she'd been driving for hours, trying to find her way back, when she saw something on the side of the road. A figure standing just off the shoulder, barely visible in her headlights. She stopped, her voice breaking, her hands shaking as she tried to catch her breath. I could tell she didn't want to go on, but something was pushing her to get the words out, like she was desperate to get rid of the memory. "I thought it was just some guy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at my car as I passed." She said she kept driving, her heart racing, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. She'd seen him standing there, unmoving, just watching her taillights fade. But a few miles down the road, she saw him again, standing on the shoulder in the exact same spot, staring at her car as she drove by. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine as she continued. She kept driving, faster this time, gripping the wheel, her whole body tense with fear. But no matter how far she drove, every few miles, he was there again, always standing in the same spot, watching her with that same blank stare. She'd finally pulled over, shaken and exhausted, thinking maybe she'd imagined it. But as soon as she stopped, she heard a tapping on the passenger window. Her voice was a raw whisper now, barely audible. I didn't look. I just hit the gas and I drove as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I got here. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a fear I'd only seen a handful of times. "He's still out there," she said, her voice trembling. "He's still waiting." I tried to reassure her, told her she was safe here, that she was probably just exhausted, that maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. She just shook her head, gripping the edge of the bed, her knuckles white. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I saw him in the parking lot. He's here." I stayed with her for a while, trying to calm her down, to get her to rest. But she refused to close her eyes, kept glancing nervously at the door, her whole body tense, ready to bolt at any moment. Eventually, we got her to lie down, sedated her enough to help her sleep, and I stepped out, thinking that would be the end of it. She'd get some rest, and in the morning, things would make more sense. But just as I was finishing up my shift, I heard shouting from down the hall. A nurse came running up to me, her face pale, telling me the girl was gone. She'd woken up in the middle of the night, ripped out her four, and bolted from the hospital. Security checked the cameras, but all they saw was her sprinting through the parking lot, disappearing into the dark. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about her, wondering if she'd made it home, if she was okay. But deep down, I knew I'd never see her again. She was gone, vanished into the night like she'd never been here at all. The package was waiting for me on my doorstep when I got home. It was small, plain brown, with my name and address scrawled across the top in black marker. I didn't remember ordering anything, and there was no return address, no markings to suggest where it had come from. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, something solid shifting slightly inside. Curious and a little cautious, I took it inside and set it down on my kitchen table, staring at it like it might open itself. After a few moments, I grabbed a pair of scissors, slicing the tape carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, polished to a deep, rich brown, with a brass latch on the front. I lifted the lid, and inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was a compass. It was unlike any I'd ever seen. Heavy, with a glass face that was scratched but intact. The brass casing had intricate engravings, tiny, swirling designs that gave it a strangely mesmerizing look. I lifted it, turning it over to examine it. Underneath, engraved in tiny letters, were the words, "For when you're ready to find it." I stared at the inscription, my pulse quickening. Who had sent this? And what was I supposed to be ready to find? It felt like a strange prank, something out of a mystery novel. I tried to think of anyone in my life who might send something like this, but no one came to mind. Curiosity finally got the best of me. I slipped the compass into my pocket and decided to take a walk, figuring maybe some fresh air would clear my mind. As soon as I stepped outside, I pulled out the compass, watching the needle spin lazily, as though it hadn't yet decided which direction to settle on. But then, with a faint click, it stopped, pointing north. I shrugged, figuring there was no harm in following it. I set off, letting the needle guide me, half convinced it was just leading me in circles. But after about 20 minutes of walking, I found myself at the edge of town, near an old, overgrown path that wound its way through the woods. The compass needle quivered slightly, then pointed straight ahead, down the path. I hesitated, feeling the first prickle of uncertainty. I'd grown up near these woods, but I'd never taken this path before. It was one of those places locals always talked about, haunted, they'd say, or bad luck. I'd never thought much of it. But now, standing at the edge with a mysterious compass urging me forward, I felt a strange thrill of excitement. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path. The woods were quiet, filled with that hushed, heavy silence that only comes when you're deep in nature. Leaves crunched underfoot, and every now and then, a bird would call out from somewhere above, but otherwise, it was just me and the compass. The farther I walked, the more it felt like I was being drawn forward by something bigger than myself, something I couldn't explain. After what felt like ages, the trees began to thin, and I found myself standing in a small clearing. In the middle of it was an old, abandoned cabin, its roof half collapsed, its walls covered in ivy and moss. The place had an eerie beauty, like it was frozen in time, left to be reclaimed by the forest. The compass needle pointed straight at the cabin, unwavering. I approached slowly, my heart pounding as I took in the details. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, dust motes floated in the beams of light that streamed through the cracks in the walls. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like old flowers. On the far wall, just visible in the dim light, was a small shelf with a few scattered objects: a glass bottle, a rusted key, a stack of yellowed papers. But what caught my eye was a leather-bound journal, lying open as if someone had left it there only moments before. I walked over and picked it up, brushing the dust off the cover. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches, fragments of poetry. Whoever had written it had a wild, looping script that was hard to read, but one entry stood out. It was dated nearly 50 years ago. If you're reading this, you must have found the compass. You must be ready to uncover what I left behind. Remember, we only find what we're truly seeking when we're lost. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just any compass. Someone had left it for me, or at least someone like me. I kept reading, captivated by the words, feeling as if I was stepping into someone else's mind, someone who had been here, in this very spot decades before. The journal described a journey, one that sounded eerily similar to the path I'd just taken. The writer spoke of a longing to leave something behind, to pass on a piece of themselves to someone who would understand. There were descriptions of hidden places in the woods, of secrets carved into trees and whispered to the wind. One line, scrawled at the very bottom of the page, sent a chill down my spine. Find the tree with the heart carved into its bark. There, you'll find the answer you seek. I closed the journal, looking around the cabin with new eyes. I knew, somehow, that this wasn't just a coincidence. I was meant to be here. The compass had led me to this place, to this journal, to this strange, impossible mystery. I stepped back outside, glancing at the compass, which now pointed toward a path leading deeper into the woods. I followed it, my senses on high alert, feeling a strange mixture of fear and excitement. After a few minutes, I spotted the tree, a massive oak with thick, knotted roots and a wide trunk. And there, right in the center, was a heart carved into the bark, weathered but unmistakable. I walked up to it, running my fingers over the heart. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt a pang of disappointment, wondering if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then my fingers brushed against something rough, and I realized there was a small compartment hidden in the tree, just barely visible. I reached in, my hand trembling, and pulled out a small, delicate locket on a silver chain. It felt warm in my hand, as though it had been waiting for me, holding some kind of hidden energy. I opened it carefully, and inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. In the back of the locket, barely visible, was a message etched in tiny, looping letters. For the one who finds this, know that you are never truly lost. I stood there for a long time, holding the locket, feeling an overwhelming sense of connection to this stranger from another time. It was as though they had known, somehow, that someone like me would come along, someone who needed a reminder that even the most winding paths lead somewhere. As I walked back through the woods, the compass resting warm and heavy in my pocket, I felt different, lighter, as though I was carrying a piece of someone else's story with me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt certain that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I still can't explain what happened last spring, and to be honest, I'm not sure I'll ever try. I wasn't hurt, and nothing truly terrible happened, but it left this strange, gnawing feeling that hasn't gone away. I've been working as a house sitter for a few years to pick up extra money. Usually it was pretty easy work. People would go out of town for a weekend or a couple of weeks. I'd feed their pets, water the plants, pick up their mail, and in return, I'd get a quiet place to myself and a decent paycheck. Most of the clients were people who worked with my mom, friends of friends, people who felt comfortable handing over their keys. One day, I got a call from a woman who'd been referred by one of my regular clients. She introduced herself as Ellen, told me she was going to be out of town for a month and needed someone to look after her house and dog. She mentioned she'd had a sitter lined up, but they'd canceled last minute, so she was scrambling to find a replacement. The pay was good, better than usual, and I'd never turned down work before, so I agreed. When I arrived at her house, I was struck by how isolated it was. The house sat at the end of a long, narrow driveway, surrounded by tall, dark trees on all sides. It was a two-story place, older and a little run down, with peeling paint and shutters that had probably seen better days. Ellen seemed nice enough, though. She was in her early 50s, friendly, if a bit frazzled. She walked me through the house, explaining where everything was, how to feed her dog, Max, and which plants needed watering. Then she stopped, pointed to a door in the hallway, and said, "That's the basement. You don't need to go down there." I wasn't planning to, honestly. Basements in old houses are usually more trouble than they're worth. Damp, moldy, full of cobwebs and old junk. So I just nodded and went on with the rest of the walkthrough, not giving it a second thought. The first week was fine. The house was quiet, and Max was an easy dog to care for, lazy, mostly, and happy to sleep by the fireplace. I'd spend my days reading, going on walks, catching up on shows, and when night fell, I'd lock the doors, check the windows, and settle in. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, it felt like a nice break from my usual routine. Then, one night around 11 p.m., I heard a thud. It was a heavy, solid sound like something falling over, and it came from the hallway near the basement door. Max, who had been lying by my feet, immediately sat up, ears perked. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that old houses make noises, that maybe something had shifted in a closet or fallen off a shelf. I tried to ignore it, but then it happened again, a loud, heavy thud. Against my better judgment, I got up and walked toward the hallway. Max followed, staying close to my side, his head low, his tail tucked. I reached the basement door, half expecting to find something leaning against it, something that could explain the noise. But there was nothing there. The door was just as I'd left it, slightly ajar, as if it hadn't been fully closed. I stood there, staring at it, and then I did something I shouldn't have. I opened the door. The smell hit me first, stale, damp, like wet earth and old wood. I took a few steps down the narrow staircase, feeling for a light switch, but there was none. I could see faint shapes in the darkness, the outlines of boxes and shelves. And then at the bottom of the stairs, I thought I saw something move, just a quick flicker of motion like a shadow shifting. My heart pounded. I didn't want to keep going, but something in me, a mix of curiosity and stupidity, I guess, pushed me forward. I took another step, peering into the darkness, trying to make out what was there. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the house settling around me, the quiet creak of wood. And then, as I turned to go back up the stairs, I heard it, a soft, faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the darkness. It was quiet, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there, a slow, deliberate scratching that sent chills down my spine. I backed up the stairs, shut the door, and told myself it was just a raccoon or a squirrel that had found its way inside. I locked the door, made sure it was secure, and tried to forget about it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something down there, just beyond the door. The next few days passed without incident. I stuck to my routine, feeding Max, watering the plants, and trying to convince myself that the noises were just my imagination. But then, a few nights later, it happened again. This time, it was around 2 a.m. I was asleep when I heard it, a loud, heavy bang, followed by that same scratching sound, slow and deliberate. I sat up, my heart racing, listening as the scratching continued, rhythmic and relentless, like something was trying to claw its way out. Max was standing at the bedroom door, his ears flat, staring down the hallway with this strange, tense look. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and went out to check the hallway. The basement door was closed, just like I'd left it, but the scratching continued, muffled but clear, like it was coming from right behind the door. I wanted to leave, but it was the middle of the night, and the thought of going outside, alone in the dark, was almost as terrifying as whatever was behind that door. So I sat up, fully dressed, with all the lights on, clutching my phone and listening as the scratching went on for what felt like hours, until it finally stopped just before dawn. When Ellen got back a few weeks later, I didn't say anything. I wanted to, but how could I explain it without sounding insane? She asked if everything went well, if I'd had any trouble, and I just nodded, handing her the keys, doing my best to pretend that everything was fine. But just as I was about to leave, she looked at me, a strange, almost knowing look in her eyes, and said, "You didn't open the basement door, did you?" I froze, every hair on the back of my neck standing up. "No," I lied. "Why?" She gave me a small, tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Good. I wouldn't go down there if I were you. Sometimes things get in, and it's best to leave them alone." I left without saying another word, my stomach twisted in knots. I tried to forget about it, to put it all out of my mind, but every now and then in the dead of night, I think about that scratching sound, about whatever was moving in the darkness at the bottom of those stairs. And sometimes I wonder if Ellen knew all along, if that's why she'd hired me in the first place. Because she knew something was down there, something that was better left alone. I'm not sure how I've made it through the past few months without losing my mind. I know that sounds dramatic, but I think you'll understand why by the end of this. And if you've ever been in a situation where reality seems to shift beneath your feet, you'll understand how easily fear can burrow under your skin and refuse to leave. I used to be a live-in caregiver. I took the job because I was in between work and the pay was decent. The family needed someone to care for their grandmother, Mrs. Holloway, who had advanced dementia. They offered me a small room in their old family home, which was isolated on the outskirts of town. The arrangement was that I'd have meals with her, assist with her daily needs, make sure she took her medications, and be there through the night. I had some experience with dementia patients before, so I thought I knew what to expect. But as soon as I moved into that house, I felt a sense of dread creeping in that I couldn't quite explain. Mrs. Holloway's bedroom was at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The family had set up a small intercom system, so I could hear if she needed help during the night. But the way the house was laid out, it made everything sound strange and amplified. At night, every creak, every shuffle, every murmur seemed to echo through the walls, magnified until it felt like the entire house was alive, listening. Mrs. Holloway was quiet during the day, mostly sitting in her chair by the window, staring out into the thick forest that bordered the property. She didn't say much, mostly mumbled to herself or stared off into space. But as soon as night fell, she'd become restless, her calm demeanor shifting to something tense and anxious. Every night, without fail, she'd ask me the same question just before bed. "Did you lock the door?" I'd always assure her I had, but she'd shake her head, her eyes clouded with fear. "Not that door," she'd say, her voice trembling. "The door to the basement." There was no basement door. Or, at least, none that I'd seen. I asked her family about it once, and they said that Mrs. Holloway was likely talking about the old storm cellar that had been bricked up years ago. The family hadn't even been down there since they'd sealed it off, and now it was just another forgotten part of the house. I tried to convince myself it was just a quirk of her dementia, but every night, she'd insist I check the basement door, her frail hand clutching mine, her eyes wide with a terror that felt all too real. One night, the intercom crackled, and I heard her calling my name. It was around 2 a.m., and I was half asleep, groggy as I stumbled out of bed and made my way to her room. When I opened the door, I found her sitting up in bed, her hands gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. "They're in the walls," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can hear them scratching." I tried to calm her down, tried to tell her that everything was fine, but she kept insisting, pointing to the corner of the room, her hands shaking. "They're coming closer. I can hear them every night." It was just her mind playing tricks on her, I told myself. I'd heard about dementia patients who suffered from auditory hallucinations, people who'd hear things that weren't there. But as I sat beside her, trying to soothe her, I thought I heard it too, a faint scratching like something small and clawed just behind the wall. I dismissed it as a raccoon or a rat. The house was old, after all, and it wasn't uncommon to have critters sneaking around, especially in a place like that. Still, the sound left me rattled, and I had trouble falling back asleep that night. Over the next few weeks, the noises got worse. They went from faint scratches to heavy thuds, like something was pressing against the walls, moving through the spaces just out of sight. I'd hear it at night, this rhythmic banging, always slow and deliberate, like something was pacing back and forth. Mrs. Holloway was terrified, and, to be honest, so was I. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or some animal nesting in the attic, but deep down, I didn't believe it. One night, I woke to the intercom crackling again. But this time, there was no voice, no sound of Mrs. Holloway calling for me. Just silence, and then the faintest sound of breathing. I lay there, frozen, every nerve in my body on edge. I tried to tell myself that it was just a glitch, just some interference. But the breathing continued, steady and slow, filling the small speaker until I felt like it was pressing down on me, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I couldn't stay in that room a second longer. I grabbed my phone and stumbled down the hall, my heart pounding as I crept toward Mrs. Holloway's room. I half expected to find her out of bed, wandering the house, but when I opened the door, she was lying there, fast asleep. I felt this strange sense of relief, and I turned to leave. But then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The door to her closet was open. I knew for a fact that it had been closed when I came in. I don't know what made me do it, but I reached out and gently pulled the door open the rest of the way. Inside, there was nothing unusual, just her old dresses, some boxes stacked neatly on the floor. But as I stood there, staring into that dark closet, I felt the air shift like something was moving, pressing in around me. And then from somewhere in the house, I heard it, the basement door. I could hear it creaking open, the hinges groaning in the quiet, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, making their way up the stairs. I slammed the closet door shut and backed out of the room, my heart racing as I stumbled into the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, echoing up the stairwell, until it sounded like they were just around the corner. I don't remember much after that. I think I ran, maybe hid in my room, clutching my phone and praying that it would stop. But I remember hearing the door to Mrs. Holloway's room creak open, hearing her start to scream, a sound so raw and terrified it didn't sound human. The next morning, Mrs. Holloway's family found me sitting in the hallway, pale and shaking, unable to speak. They asked me what had happened, but I couldn't explain it. How could I? It sounded insane, like the fevered rantings of a madwoman. All I could tell them was that I couldn't stay there anymore, that I couldn't be in that house another second. I left that day, and I never looked back. I heard through a mutual friend that Mrs. Holloway passed away a few weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, they said. But I can't stop thinking about that night, about the things she said, about the noises, the footsteps, the door that was supposed to be locked. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up and hear something in the walls, a faint scratching, a quiet breathing just behind the plaster. And every time I hear it, I remember the last thing Mrs. Holloway said to me before I left. "It's coming closer," she'd whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Closer every night." Last fall, I took a temporary job as a night receptionist at a small, barely occupied hotel out in the countryside. It wasn't anything glamorous, but I needed the money, and the manager had made it sound easy enough. Just check people in, answer the phone, and keep an eye on things, he'd said. What he hadn't mentioned was how unsettling the place would feel in the middle of the night, with only the hum of the old radiator and the occasional creak of the walls to break the silence. The hotel was a historic building, the kind that looked like it should have been a bed and breakfast or a museum instead. It had only a handful of rooms, mostly rented out to traveling businessmen or the occasional family passing through town. By 11 p.m., the lobby would be empty, the lights dimmed, and I'd have nothing to do but sit behind the front desk, flipping through magazines or scrolling through my phone. It was quiet, sure, but after a few shifts, that quiet started feeling wrong. It started on my fourth night. I was sitting at the desk, half asleep, when the lobby phone rang. It was odd because no one ever called that late, and I hadn't seen anyone come down to the lobby. When I answered, there was silence on the other end. I said hello a few times, but all I heard was faint static, like someone was just breathing on the other line. After a few seconds, they hung up. I tried to shrug it off, but a chill had settled over me that I couldn't shake. I went through the call log and saw that the call had come from one of the rooms upstairs, room 203. A quick check in the system showed that room 203 wasn't occupied. I stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again, but the lobby stayed silent. I told myself it was probably just a glitch in the system, a cross wire or something, and tried to go back to my magazine. But just as I'd settled in again, I heard a soft creak. It was coming from the staircase, the kind of sound that only happened when someone was walking down the steps, slowly and carefully, like they didn't want to be heard. I looked up, expecting to see a guest, but the staircase was empty, the lobby silent. I felt my pulse quicken. I was suddenly hyper-aware of every sound. The hum of the radiator, the tick of the old clock on the wall, the faint rustle of trees outside. I stood up, telling myself it was just the building settling, and that I was letting my mind get carried away. But then the phone rang again, jolting me so badly, I nearly dropped it. I picked up, my hand shaking slightly. This time, there was no silence. Instead, I heard a faint whisper, a voice so soft I could barely make out the words. It sounded like a woman, her voice distant, trembling. "Help me!" My heart pounded as I strained to listen, trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank or if someone was actually in trouble. But before I could say anything, the line went dead again. I checked the call log and saw, again, that it had come from room 203. I was torn. Part of me wanted to run out of the hotel right then and there, leave my keys on the desk, and never come back. But the other part, the part that kept reminding me of my bills and my empty bank account, forced me to stay. I grabbed the master key, told myself I'd just go check the room, make sure it was empty, and that would be it. As I climbed the stairs, every step felt heavier, like something was urging me to turn back. The hallway lights flickered as I made my way down the corridor to room 203, and a shiver crawled up my spine. I stood outside the door for a long moment, listening, but there was nothing. No voices, no movement, just the deafening silence pressing in on me. Finally, I unlocked the door and pushed it open, reaching for the light switch. The room was empty. Neatly made bed, a small desk by the window. Nothing unusual. I exhaled, relieved, feeling almost stupid for letting my nerves get the better of me. I stepped inside, flicking on the bathroom light just to be thorough. The mirror was cracked, its surface warped and pitted, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I turned back, ready to leave, when I noticed something odd on the bedspread. There, just in the center of the bed, was a faint dark stain. It was almost invisible against the faded fabric, but as I got closer, I could see that it had soaked deep into the material. It looked like blood. I backed out of the room, shutting the door quickly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone on the floor could hear it. I practically ran back down to the lobby, feeling that chill settle over me again, stronger this time, as if something had followed me down from the room. When I got to the desk, I felt my stomach drop. There was a note sitting right where I'd been reading, a small, crumpled piece of paper that I was certain hadn't been there before. Hands shaking, I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was barely legible, scrawled in a frantic, uneven script. It said, "He's here. Don't let him in." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Who was he? Who had left this note? Was this some kind of warning, or just a sick joke? I was so focused on the note that it took me a moment to notice the movement in the corner of my eye. There, just outside the glass lobby doors, stood a figure. Tall, motionless, his face obscured by the shadows. He was pressed close to the glass, his head tilted just slightly like he was studying me, waiting. His hand was resting on the door handle, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze, heavy and cold, like he was reaching through the glass. I took a step back, instinctively, clutching the note in my hand. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure outside the door. Slowly, his hand tightened on the handle, testing it, like he was waiting for some kind of invitation. The phone rang again, breaking the silence, and I jumped, nearly dropping the receiver. I picked it up, barely able to breathe, and listened. The same whispering voice, only now it was urgent, frantic. "He's coming. Don't let him in. Don't let him." The voice faded, replaced by static, and the line went dead. I looked back at the door, my heart in my throat, and saw that the figure was gone. The sidewalk was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching the note, staring at the door, waiting for him to return. Eventually, the sun started to rise, casting weak, gray light through the windows. I grabbed my things, left the keys on the desk, and walked out without looking back. I quit that day, told the manager I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't explain why, didn't tell him about the man at the door, the calls, the note. I just left, thinking that once I was out of there, it would be over. But it hasn't stopped. Every night, just after midnight, I get a call on my cell phone from an unknown number. If I pick up, there's only silence, sometimes faint static, sometimes that whisper just on the edge of hearing. And once, last week, I found a note slipped under my apartment door, written in that same frantic scrawl. "Don't let him in." Last night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, slow and heavy, stopping just outside my door. I lay there, frozen, barely daring to breathe, as something scraped against the door, like fingers trailing across the wood. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I feel like he's getting closer, night by night, waiting for the moment I slip, the moment I open that door. And when that happens, I don't think I'll be able to stop him. I remember the exact moment the first seed of doubt was planted. We were at a family reunion, surrounded by laughter and the chaos of kids running around the yard. I was talking with his mom, watching him across the lawn as he chatted with some cousins. Out of nowhere, his phone lit up on the picnic table beside me. I glanced down without thinking, and there it was, a message from someone named Lena with a heart emoji at the end. I felt my chest tighten, and a part of me wanted to believe it was just a friend, a joke, something harmless. But when I saw his eyes flick over to the table, watching me look at his phone, I knew something was wrong. He quickly walked over, picking up the phone and slipping it into his pocket with a forced laugh. "Just a work thing," he muttered, ruffling my hair in a way that felt dismissive. I wanted to let it go, to believe him, but the tightness in my chest didn't go away. From that day on, there was a new tension between us, invisible but palpable. Little things started to add up, like the way he'd take his phone with him into the bathroom now, or how he'd angle his screen away from me whenever he was texting. He became more distant, even in the small things. He'd forgotten our inside jokes, and he'd stopped listening when I talked about my day. I could see his mind was somewhere else, his gaze often lingering in places I couldn't follow. One night, while he was asleep beside me, I felt this overwhelming need to know. I wasn't proud of it, but I took his phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I typed in his password, half expecting it not to work. But it did, and as the screen unlocked, I felt my stomach drop. His messages were full of chats with Lena. They weren't just casual exchanges. They were intimate, playful, filled with details about his day that he hadn't shared with me in months. She called him by nicknames that I'd never heard before, ones that felt painfully close, painfully personal. I put the phone back, lying there in the dark, feeling as if the ground had vanished beneath me. I didn't wake him. I couldn't. I just lay there, listening to his steady breathing, trying to reconcile this stranger beside me with the man I thought I knew. I felt as though I'd stepped into a nightmare, one where I couldn't scream, couldn't run, trapped in the horrible silence of realization. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but everything felt wrong. I could barely look at him, and every time he spoke, it sounded like a lie. He noticed, of course, and asked if something was bothering me. I tried to brush it off, but my voice was too tight, my smile too forced. He leaned in, wrapping his arms around me, but I felt a hollow ache, knowing those same arms had held someone else in his thoughts, if not yet in reality. For days, I carried the weight of what I'd seen, waiting for the right moment to confront him, hoping he'd confess on his own. But he didn't. He went on as if everything was fine, acting as though nothing had changed, even as the distance between us grew wider, an unspoken rift we couldn't cross. I felt like a stranger in my own life, watching him from a distance, wondering how much of our time together had been a lie. Then one evening, after he came home late again with vague excuses about work, I finally broke. I asked him straight out, my voice trembling, "Who is Lena?" The question hung in the air, heavy and final, and for a moment he just stared at me, his face pale. He tried to deny it at first, saying she was just a friend, that I was overthinking. But I could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he couldn't meet my gaze, and I knew I wasn't wrong. I pressed him, my voice growing stronger as the anger and hurt poured out. He finally admitted that he'd been talking to her for a few months, that they'd connected over shared interests, that it had started innocently. But the way he said her name, soft and almost fond, told me everything I needed to know. I asked him why, demanded to know what had been missing, what I'd done wrong. He stumbled over his words, saying he didn't know, that it just happened. But his explanations felt shallow, meaningless. The truth was he'd let her in, let her become something more than just a friend, and he hadn't thought twice about the hurt it would cause me. That night, he packed a bag and left. He told me he needed time to figure things out, but I didn't want to wait for him to decide if I was enough. I'd spent months trying to be the perfect partner, to keep him happy, but none of it had mattered in the end. He'd chosen someone else, even if he hadn't fully crossed that line. And for me, the betrayal was already complete. In the days that followed, I felt like I was moving through fog, each moment heavy and surreal. Our home, once warm and filled with laughter, felt cold and empty. Friends reached out, trying to comfort me, but their words barely penetrated the numbness that had settled over me. I spent hours replaying everything in my mind, every detail, every sign I'd missed. I felt haunted by the ghost of what we'd once had, by the person I thought he was. But as the weeks went by, the fog began to lift. I started finding pieces of myself again, fragments of the person I'd been before him. I took long walks, rediscovering small joys I'd forgotten about, things that didn't revolve around him or his approval. I reconnected with friends, laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. Slowly, I learned to be okay on my own, to trust myself again. And then one day he called. He wanted to meet, to talk, to make things right. I agreed, if only to see him one last time, to let go of any lingering what-ifs. When I saw him, he looked tired, remorseful, his words filled with apologies and promises to change. But as he spoke, I felt nothing but a quiet sense of closure. The love I'd once felt had been chipped away, piece by piece, by every lie, every betrayal, until there was nothing left to salvage. I told him goodbye that day, a real goodbye, one that left no room for going back. Walking away felt like shedding the weight of every doubt, every hurt. I'd loved him deeply, but I love myself more now, enough to know that I deserve better. Looking back, I still feel a faint ache, a shadow of the pain I once carried. But I've learned to live with it, to see it as a mark of strength, a reminder of my resilience. I'm stronger now, more sure of who I am and what I deserve. And maybe that's the greatest gift he could have given me, even if it came wrapped in heartbreak. It was a regular Sunday afternoon, and I was spending it in my tiny kitchen, trying out a new recipe I'd found online. I'd recently developed an obsession with baking, probably because it let me shut out the world and focus on something simple and satisfying. That day, I was making homemade bread, kneading the dough, and letting it rise by the window. The sunlight poured in, the apartment warm and quiet, and everything felt calm, predictable. That is, until the smell of gas cut through my peaceful bubble. I stopped, my hands sticky with flour, and sniffed the air, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I'd always been careful with my gas stove, but the faint, unmistakable smell hung in the air like a warning. I went over to the stove, checking the knobs, then looked at the pilot light. It was still lit, but something felt off, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Just to be safe, I turned off the stove and opened a window to air things out. I figured maybe a burner hadn't shut off completely or there was some leftover gas from cooking earlier. I tried to shake off the worry, going back to my dough, but the smell lingered, and with it, an uneasy feeling that made it hard to concentrate. I knew gas leaks were rare, but I'd also heard stories about people ignoring that smell, brushing it off, only for things to go horribly wrong. I decided to call the gas company, more out of paranoia than anything else. The operator was calm, professional, and told me they'd send someone out just to be sure. I sat there waiting, the dough abandoned on the counter, feeling increasingly nervous as I kept replaying all the things I'd heard about gas leaks. I tried to push those thoughts aside, telling myself it was just a small precaution, that everything would be fine. About 20 minutes later, a technician arrived. He was an older man with a calm demeanor, the kind of guy who looked like he'd seen everything and wasn't easily fazed. He greeted me, went straight to the stove, and started testing for gas. He moved methodically, his expression unreadable, and I tried to gauge from his face whether or not I'd overreacted. But then he glanced up at me, his eyes serious. "You did the right thing calling us," he said. "There's a minor leak here. It's small, but these things can add up quickly in a closed space like this." He showed me a faint crack in the pipe connecting the stove to the wall, a tiny fracture I would never have noticed. I stared at it, my stomach tightening, realizing how easily I could have ignored the smell, told myself it was nothing. He turned off the gas completely and explained that it would need to be replaced. "It's lucky you noticed it," he added, packing up his tools. "A lot of people don't until it's too late." After he left, I felt a strange mix of relief and vulnerability. My apartment, this space that felt so safe and comforting, suddenly seemed full of unseen risks. That tiny crack, hidden behind the stove, could have caused something catastrophic if I hadn't paid attention. I thought back to my grandmother, who used to tell me stories about her childhood home and the ways they'd protect against fire hazards, or how they'd keep candles in every room just in case. She'd grown up respecting the risks of everyday life in a way I hadn't truly understood until now. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. I kept thinking of other things I'd overlooked, hazards I'd probably brushed aside. The next day, I bought a carbon monoxide detector, something I'd put off for months, thinking I didn't really need it. I went through my apartment, checking the cords on my appliances, testing my smoke alarm, even cleaning the vents I'd ignored for longer than I cared to admit. The next time I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Tanaka, an elderly woman who'd lived in the building for decades, I asked her if she'd ever smelled gas in her unit. She laughed a little, shaking her head, and then told me about the time she'd had a heater catch fire while she was asleep. She woke up to thick smoke filling her bedroom, barely able to breathe, and had to crawl to the door to escape. The firefighters arrived in time, but her apartment had been badly damaged, and she'd spent months staying with her sister while it was repaired. Hearing her story made me realize how close we all walk to danger without even realizing it. We live in these buildings with thin walls and aging pipes, trusting that they'll keep us safe, but sometimes that trust is just an illusion. I thought about Mrs. Tanaka's old space heater, about my cracked gas line, about all the things in life that can unravel in a second if we're not careful. From that day on, I became a little more vigilant, not just in my own space, but everywhere. I started noticing the frayed cables in the office, the cluttered exit in my apartment building's stairwell, even the leaky faucet that dripped into my bathroom sink with a rusty trickle. I'd never thought much about these things before, but now, each one seemed like a small warning, a reminder to respect the fragile balance that kept everything running smoothly. A few weeks after the gas leak scare, I was with a friend at a restaurant, chatting over dinner when the fire alarm went off. At first, everyone just looked around, half annoyed, waiting for someone to turn it off. But I felt a jolt of urgency, remembering all the things that could go wrong if we ignored it. I grabbed my friend's arm, pulling her up, insisting we head outside. She laughed, thinking I was overreacting but followed anyway. Moments later, the staff confirmed that there had been a small fire in the kitchen. It was under control, but they'd asked everyone to evacuate just in case. As we stood outside, my friend gave me a look, half impressed, half surprised. "Since when did you get so cautious?" she asked with a smile. I shrugged, feeling a strange mix of pride and relief. "I guess you just start seeing things differently when you've had a few close calls," I replied. That experience changed me in subtle but lasting ways. I became the person who notices the details, who takes the extra second to check that things are in order. It wasn't that I wanted to live in fear or let caution control my life. It was more about respecting the world around me, understanding that safety isn't a given, but something we choose to protect actively, even in small ways. Now, every time I cook, I think of that faint gas smell, the tiny fracture in the pipe, and how easily I could have ignored it. I think of Mrs. Tanaka and her narrow escape, of the fire alarm at the restaurant. I let those moments remind me to appreciate the quiet, ordinary safety of life, to look a little closer at the spaces I move through, and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel quite right. In the end, it's not about living in fear. It's about being aware, about valuing the life we have enough to protect it. And sometimes that means listening to the smallest signals, the ones that seem too subtle to matter, because those are often the ones that make all the difference. It happened last summer when my sister and I rented a small, rustic cabin near the lake. We'd both been feeling burnout from work, and a week in the wilderness sounded like the perfect escape. No cell service, no deadlines, just us, the forest, and the water. The cabin was about as remote as it gets, nestled in thick trees, with only one narrow dirt road leading to it. The kind of place where you hear your own footsteps echo back at you, and even the birds seem hesitant to break the silence. The first few days were peaceful. We'd spent hours hiking around the lake, swimming, and reading by the fire at night. It felt like we'd stepped into some forgotten corner of the world, where time moves slower. On the third night, though, something changed. It started as a soft knock on the door, just past midnight. It was so faint that at first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, slightly louder. 3 slow, steady knocks. I sat up, listening, my heart beating faster. My sister was still asleep, curled up under a blanket, and I debated whether to wake her. It was probably just a branch tapping against the door, I told myself, or maybe some animal wandering too close. But as I sat there in the dark, the knocking started again, this time louder, more insistent, as if someone were pressing their knuckles hard against the wood, waiting for me to respond. I stood up quietly, grabbing the flashlight I'd left on the table, and made my way to the door. I took a deep breath, turned on the light, and shone it through the window. But there was nothing there, just the dark shapes of trees, the empty porch, and a quiet that felt unnaturally heavy, pressing in on all sides. I waited a moment, then slowly opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The night air was cool and still, but there was something wrong about it. I could feel it, like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. I took a few steps, shining the flashlight around, my skin prickling with the feeling that I wasn't alone. Just as I turned to go back inside, I caught sight of something at the edge of the trees, a pale figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was a woman, tall and thin, her long hair hanging loose around her shoulders, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white dress, torn and dirty. She was facing away from me, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to something in the woods. I froze, every instinct telling me to get back inside. But something about her seemed familiar. The way she stood, the curve of her shoulders. It was almost like looking at a shadow of myself. "Hello!" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't move, didn't turn around. She just stood there, silent and still, her figure barely visible in the dim glow of the flashlight. I felt an urge to go to her, to reach out, but some deeper, primal part of me held me back, warning me that she wasn't what she seemed. Suddenly, she took a step forward, deeper into the trees, moving with a strange, jerky motion, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. I took a step back, clutching the flashlight, the beam shaking as I tried to steady my hand. Then, just as she disappeared into the darkness, she turned her head, just enough that I could see her face. A face that looked exactly like mine, only hollow, expressionless, her eyes empty. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. My sister stirred, waking up, her eyes bleary with sleep. "What's going on?" she mumbled, sitting up. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that I'd just seen myself? A version of me, out there, staring back at me with those empty, soulless eyes? I forced a laugh, telling her it was nothing. Just a raccoon, maybe a stray dog, and she drifted back to sleep, but I couldn't close my eyes. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door, clutching the flashlight, listening for any sign of that strange, silent figure. The next morning, I went outside, half expecting to find some trace of her. Footprints, maybe a piece of fabric snag on a branch. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty forest as if nothing had happened at all. My sister asked if everything was all right, but I just shrugged it off, not wanting to scare her, not wanting to admit that I wasn't sure myself. We left the cabin a day early. I told her I was feeling sick, that I'd had enough of the isolation, and she didn't argue. As we drove away, I looked back one last time, scanning the trees, half expecting to see that figure watching us go. But the road was empty, the forest still, nothing out of place. It's been almost a year since that night, but every so often, when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I find myself staring a little longer than I should, searching my own eyes for something I can't explain. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I see that other face staring back, hollow and empty, waiting for me. I'm still trying to piece together what happened last winter. I haven't told anyone, not fully anyway, because I'm not sure they believe me. I don't know if I'd believe me, but it's been sitting in the back of my mind, this gnawing memory that won't let go. Maybe if I put it down here, I'll be able to make sense of it. I just moved to a new city. I wanted a fresh start, a chance to hit the reset button. I found this small apartment in an older building downtown, right above a bakery. It was the kind of place that had character. Creaky floors, tall windows, exposed pipes running along the ceiling. Not perfect, but cozy in a way that made me feel at home. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was settling in, meeting new people, exploring the city. Everything felt like it was finally going right. Then the knocking started. It was a Friday night just past midnight. I'd been watching TV, dozing off, when I heard a single, loud knock on my wall. It wasn't the usual sounds of an old building settling or the creaks and groans of pipes. It was distinct, like someone rapping their knuckles, just once, right behind my bed. I figured it was my neighbor, maybe moving furniture or doing something else annoying, but harmless. So, I shrugged it off, turned off the TV, and went to bed. But just as I was about to fall asleep, there it was again. A single, solid knock. Same spot, right behind my head. I sat up, fully awake, my pulse picking up as I stared at the wall. It was silent again. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a fluke, and eventually drifted off. The next night it happened again. This time it was a series of knocks, 3, sharp and deliberate, in that same spot right above my bed. Now I was irritated. I knocked back a few quick raps, hoping my neighbor would take the hint and stop. There was a pause, and then knock, knock, knock. The exact rhythm I'd used. I'll admit, that made my skin crawl a bit. It was late, almost 2 a.m., and I wasn't in the mood for games. I pounded on the wall harder, trying to make it clear that I wasn't amused. And then the knocking stopped. Relieved, I settled back into bed, figuring it was over. But the next night, it was louder. 3 knocks right in the same spot. And this time, it was harder, almost aggressive. It felt like someone was punching the wall. I was fed up by now, so I went next door to confront whoever was messing with me. But when I knocked on my neighbor's door, no one answered. I waited, knocked again, but still nothing. I could see a light under the door, so I knew someone was home. Frustrated, I went back to my apartment, but I didn't sleep that night. The following day, I ran into my building manager in the hallway and decided to ask about the neighbor next door. I tried to keep it casual, mentioning the late-night noise and saying it was keeping me up. He looked at me, confused, and told me that the apartment next to mine was vacant. I laughed, thinking he was mistaken. I'd heard someone in there, seen the light under the door. But he insisted. The last tenant had moved out months ago, and they hadn't filled the unit yet. He even unlocked the door to show me. Inside, it was empty, just bare floors, white walls, no sign of anyone living there. I didn't know what to think. It made no sense. I'd heard the knocking. The knocking had answered me. But as much as I tried to shake it off, it got to me. That night, I barely slept lying there in the dark, waiting, listening. I kept telling myself it was just the building settling, that it was all in my head. And then, just past 3 a.m., the knocking started again. 3 loud, deliberate knocks, directly above my bed. I was done. I sat up, grabbed my coat, and left the apartment. I spent the rest of the night at an all-night diner, nursing cup after cup of coffee, watching the clock until the sun came up. When I finally went home, I decided to leave the TV on all night, hoping the noise would drown out whatever was happening. For a while, that worked. A week went by, then 2, without any knocking. I started to feel more at ease, convinced that maybe it had just been some kind of strange noise in the pipes, or something harmless that had stopped on its own. But then I found the note. It was a Saturday morning, and I'd gone out to pick up coffee. When I came back, there was an envelope slipped under my door. I thought maybe it was from the building manager, so I picked it up without thinking and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in messy, uneven handwriting. "Let me in." I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, expecting to see someone in the hall, but it was empty. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, that someone had seen me knocking on the wall and decided to mess with me. But as much as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something I couldn't explain. That night, the knocking started again. 3 loud bangs, followed by silence. I sat there, staring at the wall, my heart pounding. I didn't knock back this time. I didn't move. I just sat there, waiting, hoping it would stop. And then after what felt like hours, I heard it, the sound of scratching, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the wall. It started near the floor and moved up, right behind my bed, dragging up and down in a rhythmic pattern like someone scraping their nails against the wall from the other side. I couldn't take it. I grabbed my things, threw on my coat, and left. I didn't even bother locking the door. I stayed with a friend that night, trying to make sense of what was happening, but no matter how much I went over it, nothing made sense. The next day, I went to the building manager and told him I wanted to break my lease. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I moved out the next week, leaving that strange little apartment behind. I tried to put it all out of my mind, to forget about the knocking, the note, the sounds behind the walls. But sometimes, late at night, I'll be lying in bed, and I'll hear it again in my mind. Those 3 knocks, steady and insistent, like someone demanding to be let in. And every time I do, I remember the note, those 3 words scrawled in desperate handwriting, and I wonder who, or what, was waiting on the other side. My friend Mia had been saving up for a big trip to see her family overseas. She'd been working extra shifts, eating ramen for lunch, the whole deal. When she finally booked her flight, she was thrilled. But a few weeks before her departure, she got an email saying her flight had been canceled. No explanation, just a generic apologies for the inconvenience, and an offer to rebook for 3 times the original price. She called customer service, spent hours on hold, and finally reached a person who told her there was nothing they could do. Mia ended up buying the more expensive ticket, and while she tried to laugh it off, I could see how defeated she looked. "Feels like they've got you in a chokehold," she said, shaking her head. "You want to see your family? You pay, and it's not like you have a choice." Around the same time, my coworker Dan was going through his own version of that nightmare. He'd been interviewing for this job he was perfect for, something he'd been dreaming about for years. 3 rounds of interviews, a 2-week project test, and hours of calls with HR later, he was convinced it was in the bag. But then he got the dreaded email. "Thank you for your time, but we've decided to go in a different direction." He'd put so much into it, even turning down other offers to focus on this one. "They just strung me along," he said, deflated. "I put in all this work for nothing." That Friday, Mia, Dan, and I ended up meeting for drinks. We were all frustrated, feeling like everything we tried to work for was getting thrown back in our faces. Just as I was about to order another round, a news alert popped up on Mia's phone. It was another story about politicians trading stocks, using insider knowledge, voting on laws that would affect companies, and then buying up shares like they'd gotten the green light from the universe. So it's legal for them. But if we did it, we'd be in prison, she said, looking disgusted. We all shook our heads, silently fuming. It felt like a slap in the face, knowing the people who were supposed to serve the public were busy getting rich off secrets that would ruin the rest of us. On our way out, Dan mentioned something he'd seen at work. He works in marketing, and lately his team had been analyzing user data for targeted ads. At first, it seemed harmless, just another part of the business. But as time went on, he noticed how much data they were pulling. They were tracking people's searches, their online shopping habits, even their locations, all to sell ads with pinpoint precision. It's creepy, he admitted, almost embarrassed. They say it's just to enhance the user experience, but really it's all about profit. I looked down at my own phone, thinking of all the apps I'd downloaded without a second thought, not even questioning the permissions I was giving away. We walked past a billboard on our way home, one of those flashy gambling ads. It showed some guy jumping up and down, looking like he'd just hit the jackpot, with the words, "Your turn to win big," plastered across the screen. Mia rolled her eyes. They banned cigarette ads for being dangerous, but gambling's fine, she said. She told us about her brother, who'd recently fallen into online betting. It started as a harmless distraction, something he did to pass the time, but soon enough, he was spending more than he could afford. These ads make it look like a game, she said, shaking her head. But they're selling people a trap. That night, we all walked home with a strange heaviness. It felt like we were moving through a world designed to squeeze every last bit out of us, a place where loyalty, privacy, even our own choices were things someone else could buy and sell. Dan looked at me as we reached the street and said, "You know, sometimes it feels like the game's been rigged from the start." None of us had anything to say to that, because deep down, we knew he was right. It was supposed to be just another ordinary drive home. I'd been visiting my mom, who lives about 3 hours away, and left her place later than planned. The road stretched out dark and endless, the kind of late-night highway where you can drive for miles without seeing another car. I'd driven this route dozens of times, so I didn't think much of it as I settled in, cranked up my music, and started the long journey back. About an hour into the drive, the road dipped into a valley lined with thick pine trees that seemed to close in, swallowing the moonlight. Just as I was beginning to feel the weight of the drive, I noticed a set of headlights behind me. At first, I barely registered them, just another car on a lonely highway. But as the minutes passed, the car didn't pass me, didn't fade away, just kept a steady pace directly behind, far too close for comfort. I sped up a little, hoping they'd take the hint and either pass or back off. But they matched my speed exactly, never changing distance. I could feel my hands tightening on the wheel, my heart rate starting to pick up. There was something about those headlights, something that felt wrong. They were blindingly bright, cutting through the night with an intensity that didn't feel natural. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the headlights disappeared. I blinked, glancing in my rearview mirror. There was nothing there, just the empty stretch of road and the dark trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they turned off onto one of the smaller side roads, but I hadn't seen any turnoffs for miles. Shaking it off as paranoia, I kept driving, telling myself I'd imagine the whole thing. I was just beginning to relax when the headlights appeared again, this time closer than before. They seemed to flicker, like they were passing through smoke, but there was no fog, no mist, just that intense, unnatural glow. I glanced back, squinting, trying to see the car itself, but the light was too bright, blinding me. I felt a chill creep over me, and instinctively, I pressed harder on the gas. My car surged forward, the engine roaring as I pushed it past the speed limit, but the headlights kept pace, looming in the mirror, getting closer with every mile. Then, without warning, they vanished again. My stomach twisted as I stared at the empty road behind me, my heart racing. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to stay calm, my mind filled with every horror story I'd ever heard about mysterious lights on desolate highways. And then, the sound started. At first, it was a faint humming, so low I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder, a strange mechanical hum that seemed to come from all around me. It vibrated through the car, rattling the windows and filling the air with an electric charge that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the entire car was resonating with some kind of energy, something powerful, something alive. The headlights appeared again, this time right on my bumper, so close that I could almost feel the heat of them through the back window. The hum grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears, drowning out every other sound. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I had nowhere to go, just the narrow road winding through dark trees, the headlights looming closer, the hum vibrating through my bones. In a panic, I jerked the wheel, veering off the road and onto the narrow shoulder, slamming the brakes and skidding to a stop. My heart was racing, my breath coming in gasps as I watched the headlights pass me by, a blinding flash of light that seemed to dissolve into the darkness as it disappeared around the bend. I sat there, my hands shaking, staring at the empty road. The humming had stopped, and the silence was almost deafening in its intensity. I waited, half expecting the lights to come back, but the road remained empty, the trees silent. After a few minutes, I forced myself to start the car again, my hands still trembling. I pulled back onto the road, driving slowly, every nerve on edge, glancing in my mirror every few seconds, bracing for the sight of those lights behind me. But they never came back. I made it home just before dawn, exhausted and shaken. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even a hallucination from fatigue, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something out there on that road, something that had been watching, waiting, something that didn't belong. Now, every time I drive that highway at night, I feel a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense of being watched. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I swear I catch a glimpse of headlights flickering in the distance, waiting for me to make that drive alone again. This happened a couple of years ago, but it still feels like yesterday. It's one of those things that stays with you, that you replay over and over in your head, hoping it'll make more sense if you look at it from a different angle. But it never does. I've been working as a substitute teacher for a small district just outside the city. The schools were all older, built sometime in the 60s or 70s, with that faded institutional feel, low ceilings, dull brick walls, flickering fluorescent lights. It wasn't my dream job, but I was saving up for grad school, and teaching kids kept things interesting. One day, I got a call to cover a second grade class for a few weeks. The regular teacher had gone out on medical leave, and they needed someone to fill in until the end of the semester. The class was nice enough, just a group of typical kids with the usual mix of rowdy and shy personalities. But there was one kid, Daniel, who stood out from the start. Daniel was quiet, almost too quiet for a 7-year-old. He'd sit at the back of the room, staring out the window most of the time, not really interacting with the other kids. I figured he was just shy or had trouble adjusting to new people, so I didn't push him too hard. I'd call on him gently now and then give him encouragement, try to get him to open up. But he always gave me this blank look, like he was looking straight through me. A week into the assignment, I was packing up after class when I found a drawing left on one of the desks. It was a rough sketch of our classroom, with the kids' desks arranged in neat rows. But what struck me was that in the corner of the drawing, there was a figure, small and dark, with an odd, twisted shape, standing alone in the back of the room. I asked the kids about it the next day, holding up the paper and asking if anyone knew who'd drawn it. They all stared at me with blank expressions, and none of them claimed it. I figured it was just someone's doodle, so I dropped it and went on with the lesson. But as I looked back toward Daniel, I noticed him staring at me with this strange intensity, his eyes wide, almost frightened. The way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. A few days later, I started noticing things. Nothing obvious at first, just these small details that felt off. I'd leave the classroom to grab something from the teacher's lounge, only to come back and find the chairs rearranged or books stacked in odd piles on the desks. I'd ask the kids if they'd moved anything, but they'd just shrug, all of them swearing they hadn't touched a thing. One afternoon, during recess, I stayed behind to catch up on grading. I was sitting at my desk, working through a stack of math worksheets, when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the back of the room. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. It was quiet, like someone was muttering under their breath. I looked around, but there was no one there. Just empty desks and silence. "Daniel," I called out, even though I knew he'd gone outside with the rest of the class. No answer. The room was completely still, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I'd imagined it. But as the days went on, the whispering grew louder, always coming from the back corner of the room, always too quiet to make out any words. I'd find more drawings left on desks, always in the classroom, always with that same dark figure in the corner. Sometimes the figure was closer, standing just a little closer to the desks, its shape distorted and wrong. One day, after the kids had gone home, I decided to check the back of the room, where the figure always appeared in the drawings. I don't know what I expected to find, maybe some kind of explanation, a clue, something. But when I got there, I saw a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall, right at the base, running along the length of the floor. I crouched down, running my fingers over it, and noticed that the plaster around the crack felt soft, fragile almost. A thought hit me, a stupid, reckless idea, but I couldn't ignore it. I reached into my bag, grabbed a paper clip, and started scratching at the plaster, chipping away small bits. The crack widened, and soon I'd made a hole big enough to see through. Behind the wall, in the hollow space between rooms, was something I still can't fully explain. It was like a small, hidden chamber, cramped and narrow, with nothing inside except an old, dust-covered desk, a child's desk, almost identical to the ones in the classroom. I leaned in, squinting through the darkness, when I noticed something else. There were scratch marks on the walls, deep grooves like someone had clawed at the plaster from the inside. And carved into the desk, in jagged, uneven letters, was a name, Daniel. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, breathing hard, trying to process what I'd just seen. It didn't make any sense. How could there be a desk, a name, hidden behind the wall? I wanted to go back, to look closer, but a wave of fear washed over me, this primal, instinctive need to get out of there. I closed up the classroom and left without finishing my grading, barely able to keep myself from running down the empty hallways. That night, I lay awake, trying to make sense of it all, convincing myself that it had to be some kind of abandoned storage space, an old classroom that someone had forgotten about. But that name, scratched into the desk, kept flashing through my mind. The next morning, I went to the school library, hoping to find some kind of record, some kind of explanation. I asked the librarian if there had ever been another Daniel in the school, maybe someone who'd been in the class years ago. She gave me a strange look, then went to check the records. After a few minutes, she came back with a stack of old yearbooks, flipping through until she found a class photo from the early 90s. She pointed to one of the faces, a small boy with dark hair, unsmiling, his eyes wide and serious. "That's him," she said. "Daniel Carson. He was a second grader here, just like your Daniel." I felt a chill go down my spine. What happened to him? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The librarian hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "He disappeared," she said softly. "One day he just vanished. They never found him. Some people said he ran away. Others thought, well, no one knows for sure. But his family moved away not long after. It was a strange, sad thing. The teachers said he was a quiet kid, kept to himself, like he was haunted by something." I went back to the classroom, shaken but tried to keep my cool. I finished out the day, keeping my distance from the back of the room, from that corner that now felt darker than ever. I watched Daniel, my Daniel, sitting at his desk, staring at the window as always. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something, that he'd seen something beyond what any of us could understand. After that, I left the assignment early. I told the school that it wasn't working out, that I wasn't the right fit for the class. But the truth was I couldn't be in that room any longer. I couldn't look at that corner, at Daniel, without feeling that same bone-deep dread, that inexplicable sense of something lurking, watching. Sometimes, late at night, I'll think about that little desk hidden in the wall, the scratches on the plaster, the name carved into the wood. I wonder what happened to Daniel Carson, where he went, if he's still out there, somehow, somewhere. And every now and then, I get this strange feeling like I'm being watched. Like there's something just beyond the corner of my eye, waiting, hidden in the dark, in some forgotten space just out of reach. It was late on a Tuesday night, and I'd just gotten home from work, drained and half asleep already. I'd kicked off my shoes, turned on the lamp, and sank into the couch, ready to zone out to some mindless TV before bed. But as I reached for the remote, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, and to my horror, I saw smoke curling up from behind the TV stand. At first, I didn't move. My mind refused to connect the dots, to acknowledge the situation as real. But then I smelled it, an unmistakable, sharp odor of burning plastic. My heart leapt as the realization finally sank in. I scrambled off the couch, yanked the plug from the wall, and pulled the stand away from the outlet. Sure enough, there was a small, charred mark on the outlet itself, a smudge of soot around the prongs of the plug. My heart was racing as I stared at it, horrified at how close I'd come to starting a fire in my own living room. I called an electrician first thing the next morning, still shaken from the close call. He told me the outlet had overheated from an old, faulty connection. An easy fix, but one that could have cost me my entire apartment if I hadn't caught it in time. Most people don't even realize these things happen, he said, packing up his tools. They think outlets are safe, that nothing will go wrong, until it does. That thought stayed with me long after he'd left, sparking a series of changes in how I saw my apartment. I started noticing the little things, the frayed edges on the power cords, the loose screws in the furniture, the clutter around the smoke alarm in the kitchen. Each one seemed to pulse with a quiet warning, a reminder of how easily these harmless things could turn into real hazards if ignored. I spent the next few days on high alert, reorganizing everything, checking the outlets, rearranging my furniture to keep it away from the plugs. A few weeks later, I went to visit my friend Ryan, who just bought a small fixer-upper outside of town. He was proud of it, showing off every room with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsessive. But as I looked around, I couldn't help noticing some of the same potential hazards I'd found in my own place. The walls had old, peeling paint. The staircase railing wobbled when I put my hand on it, and the basement was littered with junk that was piled high against an old space heater. "Hey, have you thought about getting some of this stuff checked out?" I asked, trying to sound casual, like the wiring or that heater in the basement. Ryan laughed it off, waving a hand as if to brush away my concerns. "It's an old house, man. They don't make them like this anymore. These walls are solid." He tapped the wall for emphasis, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I knew that no matter how solid a house was, there were still hidden dangers, risks that lurked behind drywall or in outdated wiring. A few weeks later, Ryan called me late at night, his voice trembling. His basement had caught fire. Thankfully, he'd been home to catch it in time, dousing the flames with an extinguisher he'd bought just a week before. The cause? The ancient space heater I'd seen, which had sparked against some old cardboard boxes he'd stacked up nearby. He'd been planning to clear out the basement eventually, but that eventually had almost cost him everything. Hearing the fear in his voice, I thought back to my own apartment, to that first flicker of smoke behind my TV, and realized how lucky we'd both been. These weren't just freak accidents. They were preventable, things we'd brushed off as no big deal, until we had no choice but to face the consequences. I didn't need another close call to remind me of how fragile our safety truly is, how one small oversight can spiral into something catastrophic. Ryan and I spent the next weekend checking every inch of his house, from the wiring in the attic to the insulation around the pipes in his crawl space. It was tedious, but by the time we were done, we both felt a strange sense of relief, as if we'd taken back some control over the invisible threats lurking around us. Since then, I've approached my life with a new level of caution, a respect for the quiet dangers that surround us daily. I double-check my outlets, I clear the clutter away from any heat source, and I've developed a habit of running through my own mental safety checklist before I leave for work or go to bed. It's not paranoia, exactly, just a deep awareness of how close I've come, of how quickly everything can change. These days, I try to share that perspective with others. I'll casually mention to friends to test their smoke alarms, or point out frayed cords when I see them, though I know I sound a bit overbearing sometimes. But every time I do, I think back to that moment, to the flicker of smoke behind my TV, and I know I'd rather be cautious than complacent. In the end, it's the small choices, the awareness of hidden risks, that help us keep our lives and the places we call home safe. It's funny how quickly you can go from feeling like the luckiest person in the world to questioning every moment you thought was real. I met him through mutual friends at a concert, the kind of whirlwind night where you're screaming the lyrics to songs you barely know, lost in the rush of the crowd. He smiled at me from across the room, and by the end of the night, we were inseparable. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the world, like nothing else mattered. We'd laugh about it later, calling it fate, like the universe had somehow aligned just for us. For a while, it felt perfect, a blissful haze of inside jokes, lazy Sundays, and secret spots in the city that felt like ours. But it was the little things, the smallest hints, that started to tear at the edges of my happiness. I didn't see it all at once. Instead, it came in pieces, tiny cracks I tried to ignore until they turned into fractures I couldn't ignore anymore. The first crack came when I noticed him on his phone all the time, more than usual. I used to joke that he was glued to it, but now it felt different. He'd sit across from me at dinner, his eyes flicking down to the screen every few seconds, his face lit up by messages he'd tilt just out of my line of sight. I told myself it was harmless, probably work or some group chat, but the nagging feeling in my stomach started to grow. And it only grew when I began to catch him smiling down at it in a way he hadn't smiled at me in weeks. One night, as we were lying in bed, I leaned over and asked who he was texting. He gave me a quick, dismissive answer, telling me it was just a friend, but his voice had this forced nonchalance that didn't sit right with me. He tried to laugh it off, turning the question back on me, but there was something about the way he looked away that set off alarm bells in my head. It wasn't long after that he started working late. He'd always prided himself on having a solid work-life balance, always home by 6, always complaining about staying late even when he had to. But suddenly, he was going in early, staying late, and then, as if that weren't enough, he started going out for drinks with the team. I tried to be supportive, tried to give him space, but each excuse felt like it added another weight to the knot in my stomach. One Friday, he told me he'd be home by 8. I decided to surprise him by making his favorite dinner, setting the table with candles, something simple and sweet. But as the hours ticked by, 8 turned into 9, 9 into 10. I texted him, asking if everything was okay, and he replied with a quick, "Just caught up here, sorry." That night, he came home well past midnight, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine, his smile too big, his laughter too loud. I asked him if he'd been with anyone, and he just waved it off, saying it was just work and that I was being paranoid. But I wasn't paranoid. I was noticing things that couldn't be ignored. The guarded way he handled his phone, the nights he'd disappear, the way he'd look at me, almost guilty, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. The final straw came one weekend when he said he was going on a work trip out of town. We hadn't spent a weekend apart in months, and the sudden trip seemed so out of the blue that it made my head spin. He was vague on the details, packing quickly, his face a mixture of excitement and guilt that he tried to hide. That Saturday night, I got a message from one of my friends. She'd seen him out at a bar in town with another woman. The text was short, direct, with a photo attached, showing him with his arm around her shoulders, laughing in a way that I hadn't seen in months. My hands shook as I looked at the picture, the full reality hitting me like a wave I couldn't outrun. When he got home, I was waiting. He tried to smile at me, to laugh off my accusations, but there was a look in his eyes that told me he knew he was caught. I asked him if he loved her, if he'd ever thought about the impact this would have, and he stammered out excuses, claiming it wasn't serious, that he hadn't meant to hurt me. But his words felt hollow, empty, a pale attempt at justification that only deepened the wound. That night, I told him to leave. I watched as he packed his things, each item a painful reminder of what we'd once had, of the memories that were now tainted by lies. When the door finally closed, I collapsed onto the couch, feeling the weight of the last few months hit me all at once. It was like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving only raw, exposed hurt in its place. In the days that followed, I went through all the phases of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, sadness. I'd sit up at night, replaying every moment in my mind, wondering what I'd done wrong, if there had been signs I'd missed. Friends came over, tried to distract me, brought me food, but there was this hollow ache that nothing could fill. I deleted his photos, blocked his number, did everything I could to erase his presence from my life. But the pain remained, sharp and unyielding. But slowly, day by day, I started to heal. I found myself again, beneath the heartbreak and the betrayal. I went back to the things I loved, the things that made me feel whole. I took up running, went back to painting, started saying yes to spontaneous plans with friends. Each step was small, but each one felt like a reclamation of my life, of my happiness. Months later, I ran into him by chance at a coffee shop. He looked different, like a shadow of the person I'd once loved, and when he saw me, he hesitated, his face flickering with regret. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I just smiled a calm, genuine smile and walked away. In that moment, I realized that I'd let go, that he no longer had power over me. Looking back, I can see that he taught me a painful but invaluable lesson. I learned that my worth isn't defined by someone else's love or loyalty. I am stronger, wiser, more resilient than I ever knew. And now, I walk forward with a heart that's been mended, knowing that one day, I'll find a love that's worthy of everything I have to give. The voicemail was from a number I didn't recognize. It came in late on a Friday night, just as I was getting into bed. I almost ignored it, figuring it was a wrong number or some scam, but something made me press play. Hi, is this Jacob? This is Carrie from Lakewood Veterinary Clinic. We have a dog here, a golden retriever named Murphy. The tag says you're the owner, but he's been missing for a while, hasn't he? Anyway, he's here safe and sound. You can call us back anytime tomorrow. My heart dropped. Murphy, my golden retriever, who'd vanished nearly 4 years ago. I hadn't even known how he'd gotten out. One minute he'd been in the yard, the next he was gone. I'd put up posters, called shelters, driven through the neighborhood for hours every day for weeks. But as time passed, I'd finally, reluctantly, accepted that he wasn't coming back. And now, after all this time, he was suddenly here. The clinic was a small, old place on the other side of town, the kind that looked more like a little house than a business. I barely slept that night, so I was the first person there the next morning, pacing by the front door until a sleepy-looking receptionist unlocked it. "Jacob," she asked, glancing up with a faint smile, already knowing why I was there. "Come with me." She led me through the clinic. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with that faint, comforting smell of fur and pet food. My stomach churned with nerves, my heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. What would he look like? Would he remember me? We reached a small exam room, and she gave me a reassuring nod before opening the door. Inside, a golden retriever was lying on a blanket, his back to the door. His coat was grayer than I remembered, and he seemed thinner, worn down. But as soon as he heard the door, his ears perked up, and he lifted his head. "Murphy," I choked out, my voice cracking. He turned slowly, and as soon as he saw me, his eyes lit up, that old familiar spark I'd thought I'd never see again. He let out a small, whimpering bark and scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward me. I dropped to my knees, my arms open, and he rushed into them, burying his head in my chest, his tail wagging like he was trying to shake the whole room. "Oh my God, Murphy, you're really here," I whispered, my throat tight as I held him, feeling his warm fur, the rough pads of his paws pressing against my arms. He licked my face, whimpering and snuffling as if he couldn't believe it either. The vet gave us a few minutes before coming in to explain. "It's a bit of a mystery," she said, gently scratching Murphy behind the ears as he leaned happily into her. He was brought in by a couple who found him wandering near their cabin up north. They couldn't keep him and saw his tag, so they called us. "He's been through a lot, it looks like, but he's okay." I listened, nodding, but I was too overwhelmed to fully process her words. All I could do was look at Murphy, my old friend, safe and sound and somehow back in my arms. The drive home felt surreal. Murphy sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, his tail thumping every so often against the seat. I kept glancing over, just to make sure he was really there, that this wasn't some strange dream. Every time, He'd look back, as if reassuring me he was staying. When we got home, he trotted around the yard, sniffing every corner, reacquainting himself with his old territory. I followed him, watching as he paused by the tree where he used to bury his toys. By the corner of the fence, he'd always peek through to watch the neighbor's cat. It was like he was picking up the pieces of the life he'd left behind, one sniff at a time. That night, as I sat on the couch, Murphy curled up beside me, his head resting on my knee like he used to. I couldn't shake the questions swirling in my mind. Where had he been all this time? Who had he been with? And what had he seen? I wished he could tell me, wished he could somehow explain those 4 missing years. But as the days passed, Murphy settled back into life with me, as though he'd never left. He was older, sure, a little slower, and with a slight limp that hadn't been there before. But he was still Murphy, my loyal, loving companion, my best friend. It was like we were picking up where we'd left off, both of us too grateful to ask too many questions. One afternoon, about a week after he'd come home, I found myself rummaging through an old box of his things I'd never been able to bring myself to throw away. I pulled out a worn tennis ball, his old leash, and finally, a small, blue bandana he used to wear around his neck. As soon as I held it up, his tail started wagging, his eyes lighting up with recognition. I knelt down, tying the bandana around his neck, and he gave me a look that said more than words ever could. It was like he was telling me that he was back, that he wasn't going anywhere this time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like things were truly, finally right. We fell back into our old routines, our morning walks, our lazy Sundays on the couch. Life moved forward, and I tried not to think too much about those missing years. They felt like a distant, half-remembered dream, something I could almost convince myself had never happened. Then one night, as we were settling in, I noticed something in Murphy's mouth as he came into the living room. He was holding a small, weathered tag, a heart-shaped dog tag that I'd never seen before, its surface scratched and worn. I took it from him gently, squinting to make out the faint engraving. On one side, there was a name, Charlie, and on the other, barely visible, was an address from a town 3 hours north, the kind of place that probably only had one street and a diner. I stared at the tag, my mind racing with possibilities. Murphy had been with someone. Someone had called him Charlie. And for a while, he had been their dog. I felt a pang of sadness, wondering what his life had been like, who had loved him during those missing years. The next day, I called the number on the tag, not sure what to expect. After a few rings, a woman answered, her voice quiet and kind. Hello. I cleared my throat, feeling a strange mix of nerves and guilt. I found a dog tag with the name Charlie on it. I was wondering if you might have lost a dog. There was a long silence, and I thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't lose him, she said softly. We found him. He was wandering by the road, all alone. We took him in, and he saved us in a way. But one day, he wandered off again, and we never saw him after that. Her voice cracked, and I could hear the unspoken words, the worry, the hope that he was safe, the pain of letting him go. He's back home now, I said gently. He's safe, and he's loved. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Please just tell him we said goodbye. Tell him he was a good dog. I promised her I would, and we hung up, the silence settling around me like a gentle weight. That night, I sat with Murphy, running my fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth and love that had brought him back to me. He was my dog, my best friend, and for a time he had been someone else's too. We shared a quiet, profound understanding in that moment, a bond that transcended words. You were loved, buddy, I whispered, holding him close. By me and by them. You were loved the whole time. I can't shake what happened that night, and I don't think I ever will. I've tried telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down I know it wasn't. I'd been working as a night cleaner at a hospital for a few months. A small place, quiet, and usually uneventful, just the kind of low-key job I was looking for. Cleaning hospitals is no joke. You're alone most of the time, and the silence becomes this constant, almost heavy presence around you. But it suited me. I'd clean the empty rooms, mop the floors, and organize supplies. all while barely seeing another person. The only people on shift that late were the nurses and one or two doctors who usually kept to the ER. It was almost peaceful. One night, I was assigned to clean a part of the building I'd never worked in before. It was an older wing of the hospital, mostly used for storage and offices. I was supposed to mop the floors, wipe down the counters, and check that all the doors were locked. I remember feeling uneasy as I walked down the narrow hallway. The lights were dim, flickering slightly, and there was this musty smell, like the place hadn't been properly aired out in years. It was almost midnight, and I was the only one in that part of the building. I started with the offices, mopping and dusting, trying to ignore the creaks and groans that echoed through the hallway. Old buildings settle, I told myself. It's just the pipes. I was nearly finished when I came to the last door at the end of the hall. I'd been told that the old wing had been closed off, with only a few rooms used for storage. So I was surprised when I saw that the door was open, just slightly ajar, like someone had forgotten to close it. It was dark inside, but I could make out the shape of a hospital bed and some equipment. I thought it was odd, but I figured it was just another storage room, and I stepped in to take a look. The room was empty, except for the bed, covered in a thin, white sheet and a small, ancient-looking table in the corner with a single chair next to it. The walls were bare, and the air was stale, almost suffocating. I had my mop bucket with me, and as I started to mop, I noticed something on the floor near the bed. It was a worn, yellowed piece of paper, folded up neatly. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it was just trash, but when I unfolded it, I froze. In small, cramped handwriting, it read, "Don't look under the bed." I stood there, staring at the note, my hands shaking slightly. I knew it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe one of the other cleaners had left it there to mess with me, knowing I was the new guy. But still, there was something about that note that felt wrong, like it was left there for a reason. I tried to shake it off, shoved the paper into my pocket, and kept cleaning, telling myself not to let my imagination get the best of me. But the entire time, I couldn't stop glancing at that bed, at the sheet draped over it, hiding whatever was underneath. I kept telling myself it was just an old storage bed, empty and used. But the longer I stayed in that room, the more the urge grew, this overwhelming compulsion to check. Just a quick peek, I thought, just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. So finally I gave in. I walked over, knelt down, and lifted the edge of the sheet. My heart was pounding as I leaned forward, peering into the darkness under the bed. There was nothing there, just a bare floor, dust, and a few old stains. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling a little ridiculous for letting a piece of paper get to me. I dropped the sheet, stood up, and went back to my mop. But as I reached for the mop handle, I heard something, this faint, almost inaudible sound coming from under the bed. It was a quiet, shallow breathing, so soft that I thought maybe I was imagining it. But then it grew louder, more distinct, until it was unmistakable. Someone or something was breathing under the bed. I felt a chill run through me, every instinct screaming at me to get out of that room, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the bed, listening as the breathing grew louder, more labored, like whoever was under there was struggling, barely clinging on to each breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I backed up, nearly tripping over my mop bucket, and then I turned and bolted out of the room, not bothering to look back. I didn't finish my shift that night. I left my supplies where they were, walked straight out of the hospital, and didn't go back. I quit the next morning, told them I wasn't feeling well, made up some excuse about another job. I couldn't tell them the truth. How would I even begin to explain it? A few weeks later, I ran into one of my old co-workers from the hospital, a guy who'd been there for years. We started talking, and he asked me why I'd left so suddenly. I tried to play it off, but he kept pressing, saying he'd heard something about me being assigned to clean the old wing that night. I hesitated, and finally, I asked him if he knew anything about that room, about the bed, if anyone else had experienced anything strange there. He gave me this strange look, like he was deciding whether or not to tell me something. Then he leaned in and said, "You know about room 221, right?" I shook my head. He sighed, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. Years ago, before they shut down that wing, That room was used for palliative care. A lot of people died in there. It was one of those places the staff tried to avoid, like there was a heaviness to it. And then, one night, one of the nurses heard something coming from that room. Breathing. She thought it was a patient, that maybe they'd forgotten someone in there. But when she looked under the bed, there was no one. Just empty. He stopped, a nervous smile on his face. They say she left right after that. Didn't even clock out. The hospital ended up closing off that wing not long after. I felt my stomach twist as he told me this. Every hair on my body standing on end. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know any more than I already did. I haven't set foot in that hospital since, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I'll find myself lying awake, straining to hear over the silence, half expecting to hear that faint, shallow breathing again, creeping out from the dark corners of my room. And every time I do, I remember that note, those simple, desperate words. Don't look under the bed. I'll never forget the night I got the message from my old college roommate, Eric. It had been years since we last talked. He'd moved away, and life just took us in different directions. We'd been close in school, but as time went on, we lost touch, and I hadn't really thought about him until that night when he reached out. It was just a short message, asking if I could call him. Something about the way he wrote it made my stomach clench. He sounded off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I figured he was going through something and needed a friend, so I called him back. When he answered, his voice was shaky, almost hollow. "I need your help, man," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I could tell he was trying to keep it together, but there was this strange edge in his tone, like he was trying not to break down. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my own anxiety in check. He took a long pause before answering. "I've been hearing things, seeing things." He trailed off, and there was a shuffling sound on his end, like he was looking over his shoulder. "Eric, what do you mean? Are you okay? Where are you?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I'm at my place, but something's here. It's been here for days. I just need someone else to see it, to make sure I'm not losing my mind." Against my better judgment, I agreed to go over. His place was about an hour away, and it was already late, but something in his voice made me feel like he was genuinely afraid for his life. I grabbed my keys and drove through the empty streets, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just going through a rough patch and needed someone to talk to. When I got there, the house looked normal enough from the outside, but the second I stepped inside, I felt this oppressive weight in the air. Everything was dark, and the blinds were drawn, casting the room in deep shadows. Eric was sitting on the couch, his face pale, eyes wide with a kind of hollow, haunted look that I'd never seen on him before. He barely acknowledged me as I came in, just gestured for me to sit down. "It's in here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's in here?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I don't know," he murmured, glancing around the room as if he expected something to jump out at us. "It started last week. I'd hear things at night. Strange noises, footsteps, whispers, like someone was watching me. But every time I checked, there was nothing there." He went on to tell me about the small things that started happening around the house. Lights flickering, doors creaking open, objects moving to places he hadn't left them. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and see shadows in the corner of his bedroom, lingering just long enough to make him question his sanity. I tried to stay logical, grounded. It could be electrical issues or maybe a trick of the light, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt like I was lying to both of us. There was something wrong with that place, something that made my skin crawl. Eric just shook his head. "It's not just shadows or noises, man. It's something else." He hesitated, glancing toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. "I need you to see it." Reluctantly, I followed him down the narrow hallway. The place was eerily silent, and every creak of the floorboards under my feet felt deafening. He led me to his bedroom door and stopped, turning to me with that same haunted look in his eyes. "It's in there," he whispered, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob. The room was dark, the air thick with the same heavy, suffocating presence I'd felt the moment I walked in. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the room. Eric pointed, his face pale, eyes fixed on the corner. "It stays there, watches me, waits for me to fall asleep," he whispered, as if he were afraid of drawing its attention. I followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness, and for a moment, I saw nothing. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a faint, twisted shape, like a figure crouching in the shadows, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but I forced myself to stay. "Eric, what is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He just shook his head, his expression one of absolute terror. "I don't know. It looks like a person, doesn't it? But it's not." The figure shifted, just slightly, like it was aware of us watching it. I felt my blood turn to ice. I wanted to turn on the light, to dispel the darkness, and convince myself it was just a trick of the shadows. But before I could move, Eric grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "Don't turn on the light," he hissed, his voice frantic. "It doesn't like the light. It gets angry." I stared at him, horrified. "How do you know that?" He swallowed, his eyes never leaving the shadow. "I tried once." The light flickered, went out, and when I looked back, it was right in front of me, close enough that I could feel its breath. A cold sweat broke out over my skin as I watched the shadow in the corner. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I didn't know what to do. I'd never felt so helpless, so trapped. Then, without warning, Eric released his grip on my arm and stepped back, his face pale and empty. "I think it wants you now," he whispered, his voice hollow, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. Before I could react, the door slammed shut, and I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for light, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, filling the room with this horrible, skittering noise that felt like it was crawling up my spine. I turned toward the door, but it wouldn't budge, like something was holding it shut. Panic set in, and I started pounding on it, yelling for Eric to open it, but there was no answer, only the relentless scratching that was getting closer. Then, just as I was about to break down, everything went silent. The scratching stopped, the air grew still, and for a brief, terrible moment, I thought I was alone. But then I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze, every nerve screaming, my body paralyzed by a fear so intense I thought I might pass out. Slowly, I turned, and there, just inches from my face, was a figure, its features obscured, its eyes two empty pits of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and consuming, like it was peeling away every layer of my being, digging into my thoughts, my memories, everything that made me me. And then it spoke, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, echoing inside my head. "You shouldn't have come." The next thing I knew, I was on the front lawn, the cold grass beneath me, gasping for air. I stumbled to my feet, my heart racing, and looked back at the house. The lights were off, the windows dark, as if no one had been there for years. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember anything after that. All I know is that when I woke up the next day, I had a single missed call from an unknown number and a voicemail that was nothing but static. I tried to call Eric, but his number was disconnected, and when I went back to the house, it was empty, abandoned, with no sign that anyone had lived there recently. I asked around, but no one remembered anyone named Eric living there. It's been weeks now, and every night, just as I'm about to drift off, I hear it, the faint scratching sound coming from the darkest corner of my room, waiting. And every night, I lie there, too afraid to look, too afraid to breathe, praying that it won't come any closer. I'm a paramedic, and after more than a decade in this job, I thought I'd seen everything. I've responded to overdoses, car crashes, shootings, things that leave their mark on you, no matter how much you try to shake it off at the end of the day. But there's one call I can't stop replaying, even months later. I keep going over every second, every detail, wondering what I missed, if I could have done something differently. It was a little after midnight when we got the call. Unresponsive mail, possible overdose, found by a neighbor. Standard enough on a Friday night, especially in that part of town. My partner and I were a few minutes away, so we got there fast. The neighbor, a middle-aged guy with a worried look, met us at the door, muttering that he hadn't seen the man for days, and had gone to check on him after noticing a smell coming from his apartment. When we stepped inside, I could tell right away something was off. The air was thick with the stench of stale smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. The apartment was a mess, clothes, trash, food containers piled everywhere. And there, in the middle of the room, sprawled on an old recliner, was the man. His skin was a sickly shade of gray, his eyes closed, his body completely still. My first thought was that we were too late, that he was already gone. I went over and felt for a pulse, expecting to find nothing. But against all odds, there it was, faint and erratic, but there. We got to work quickly, checking his vitals, getting him on oxygen. His breathing was shallow, labored, and his skin was cold and clammy. I leaned in to get a better look at him, and that's when I noticed something strange. His wrists and ankles were bruised, with deep red marks, almost like he'd been restrained. I glanced at my partner, who looked back at me, eyebrows raised. This wasn't just an overdose. Something else had happened to him. Just as I was about to call it in, the man's eyes flew open. He looked right at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. His gaze was wild, terrified, like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare. He tried to speak, but all that came out were hoarse, gasping sounds. I leaned in closer, telling him he was safe, that we were here to help. His hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into my skin. "Don't let them find me," he whispered, barely audible, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting someone to burst in at any second. I tried to calm him down, to reassure him, but he kept shaking his head, repeating the same thing over and over. "Don't let them find me. Don't let them take me back." We managed to get him onto the stretcher, and he finally stopped struggling, his body going limp as he slipped in and out of consciousness. His words were rattling around in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been running from something or someone. As we loaded him into the ambulance, I noticed the neighbor watching us from the doorway, a strange look on his face, almost like he was relieved. I chalked it up to the stress of the situation, but something about it felt off. During the ride to the hospital, the man was mostly unresponsive, but every now and then he'd mumble, whispering things I couldn't quite make out. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us on edge, but we focused on keeping him stable until we got him to the ER. Once we arrived, we handed him off to the doctors and watched as they wheeled him down the hallway, his hands still reaching out like he was trying to hold on to something or someone. I thought that would be the end of it. We'd done our part. He was in the hospital's care now, and I assumed we'd never see him again. But a week later, I ran into one of the ER nurses who'd worked on him. She looked uneasy when I mentioned him, and after a pause, she leaned in and told me that the man had disappeared. He'd checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice, still weak, barely able to stand, and just vanished. No one had seen or heard from him since. For some reason, I couldn't let it go. I found myself thinking about him all the time, wondering where he'd gone, if he was okay. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was like a splinter lodged in my brain. Then a couple of months later, we got another call late at night. Unresponsive male, same apartment building, suspected overdose. My heart sank. I knew it was him before we even arrived. When we walked into that same apartment, it was almost identical to how we'd left it. The same mess, the same stale air. But this time, there was no faint pulse, no last-minute miracle. He was slumped over in that same recliner, his skin cold, his eyes half open, staring at nothing. My partner checked for signs of life, but he was gone. I stared at him, feeling a strange mix of dread and inevitability. Like this had all been set in motion the moment he'd asked me not to let them find him. As we waited for the coroner, I took a look around the apartment, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed something on the floor by his chair. A stack of old notebooks, worn and tattered. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped one open. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, line after line, page after page, detailing a story that was hard to believe. He'd been on the run, hiding from people he described only as them. There were references to places he'd stayed, people he'd met, but every entry circled back to the same fear, that they were closing in, that he could feel them getting closer. His writing grew more frantic, more disjointed, the closer it got to the end. The last entry was written just a day before we found him the first time. It simply said, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. If they find me again, it's over." I closed the notebook, a heavy feeling settling in my chest. I don't know who he was hiding from, if it was real or just something in his mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been right, that whoever he was afraid of had finally caught up to him. I handed the notebooks to the coroner, feeling a strange sense of finality, like a chapter was closing. But that unease never left. I still think about him, lying there in that dark apartment, convinced someone was out to get him. In this line of work, you're trained to focus on what's in front of you, the injuries, the symptoms, the facts. But every once in a while, you're left with questions that have no answers, fears that don't fade, and stories that refuse to let you go. My friend Laura had been counting down to this concert for months. She'd saved up, planned her outfit, and rallied her friends, all for the chance to see her favorite band live. The tickets went on sale at noon, and she was ready, refreshing her screen like a pro. But within seconds, they were all gone. Moments later, she checked a resale site and saw the same tickets listed for triple the price. Her face fell as she stared at her screen, seeing the concert she'd waited for slip right through her fingers. "It's like they don't even care about the fans," she said quietly, looking crushed. "They just care about who can pay the most." Around the same time, I was going through a hiring process that had taken over my life. After multiple rounds of interviews, tests, and endless check-ins, it finally seemed like I was the front-runner. HR even said they were very excited to bring me on board. But weeks went by with no follow-up. When I finally got a hold of the recruiter, she was all apologies, telling me they'd decided to restructure and weren't hiring for that role after all. I'd poured so much energy into it, turning down other interviews, thinking this was a sure thing. Why even make me jump through all those hoops? I muttered to myself, feeling like the butt of some cruel corporate joke. A few days later, Laura and I grabbed coffee to commiserate. She was still reeling from the ticket fiasco, and I could tell she felt just as disillusioned as I did. We sat there, trying to laugh it off, but a heaviness lingered between us. Just as I was about to change the subject, a news alert buzzed on her phone. It was a headline about politicians trading stocks on insider knowledge. Again, these were the same people who were supposed to be passing laws to help everyone. But here they were, making moves that only help themselves. So they get richer while we get played? Laura said, showing me the headline. It's like they don't even pretend to care about fairness anymore. Our friend Marcus joined us at the cafe shortly after. He works in data analysis for a big tech company, and lately he'd been feeling uneasy about what he was seeing at work. "You wouldn't believe how much we know about people," he told us, lowering his voice. Location, shopping habits, what times they're active online. And we're selling all of it. He explained how companies package and sell data to advertisers, turning our private lives into products. They say it's just to help businesses, but really, it's all about squeezing out more profit. We all looked down at our phones, realizing they were tracking everything we did, every move, every search. Privacy felt like some relic of the past, something we'd unwittingly signed away without even realizing it. Later that evening, the three of us decided to go to a bar and let off some steam. As we waited for our drinks, we noticed a flashy gambling ad on the TV above us. It showed a group of friends cheering, celebrating a big win, making it look like the easiest thing in the world. Laura shook her head, saying, "It's like they're encouraging people to throw their money away." She told us about her cousin who'd gotten into online betting and quickly lost control. He'd started with small bets just for fun, but it spiraled fast. Now he was deep in debt, trying to claw his way back out. "It's everywhere," she said. "They're just baiting people to fall into the same trap." As we left the bar, we passed a group of police with a drug-sniffing dog. They were randomly stopping people, asking to see IDs, having them empty their pockets. One guy tried to ask why, but the officer just told him to stand aside without any real explanation. We kept our heads down and walked past, but the whole thing left a bitter taste. "It's like they can just do whatever they want," Marcus muttered. "Like our rights don't even matter." By the end of the night, we were all drained. It felt like every part of life had been hollowed out, twisted into something designed to benefit only those with money or power. Laura looked at me as we reached her street and sighed. Everything feels like a scam, she said. The tickets, the jobs, the ads, everything. And standing there in the quiet of the night, I knew she was right. It was a late summer night, and I was out on my uncle's farm, helping him close up for the evening. The place was huge, sprawling fields that stretched out to the tree line and dipped down to a murky pond that the locals claimed was bottomless. I'd heard every ghost story and urban legend about that pond growing up, tales of lost children, strange noises, mysterious lights. But standing there with my flashlight, I told myself it was just water, mud, and old stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far. My uncle had gone inside, and I was left alone to finish locking up the barn. The crickets were loud, an unbroken symphony echoing in the thick night air, and everything around me was cloaked in darkness, except for the faint light spilling from the farmhouse window and the thin beam of my flashlight. As I was closing the last barn door, I heard it, a faint splashing sound from the direction of the pond. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. It could have been an animal, I thought, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of it was wrong, too deliberate, too heavy, like someone was slowly wading through the water. I told myself to ignore it, to finish up and get back to the house, but something drew me in, that same curiosity that always got me into trouble. I started walking toward the pond, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick night, the beam bobbing across the tall grass. The splashing stopped just as I reached the edge of the water, the surface rippling slightly as if something had just sunk below. I swept the flashlight over the pond, trying to catch a glimpse of anything, but there was nothing, just inky black water and the vague shapes of weeds at the edge. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a voice, faint and soft, coming from the middle of the pond. "Help, please." It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it, but then it came again, a thin, desperate whisper that seemed to carry across the water, filling the silence between the cricket's song. I shone my light over the surface again, heart pounding, half expecting to see someone out there, but the pond was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Is someone there?" The only answer was silence, and a deep, unsettling chill crept over me. I knew I should leave, get my uncle, let him know what I'd heard. But something in that voice, that haunting whisper, kept me rooted to the spot. Then the water started to move. It was subtle at first, small ripples expanding outward, but then slowly something began to rise from the center of the pond. At first, it looked like a tangle of reeds or old debris. But as it rose higher, I realized it was a figure, a person slowly emerging from the water. I froze, my flashlight locked onto the shape as it came closer, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure took another step toward the shore, revealing a face, pale and drawn, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It was a woman, her hair tangled with weeds, her clothes soaked and clinging to her frame, dripping with water that pooled around her feet. She didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Help me." I wanted to ask who she was, what she was doing there, but my throat was too tight, my body frozen. She took another step, her feet sinking into the mud at the water's edge, and that's when I saw them. Her hands, or rather, what was left of them. They were skeletal, the flesh worn away, her fingers little more than bones wrapped in thin, waterlogged skin, reaching out toward me. The spell broke, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. I turned, heart pounding, and sprinted back toward the farmhouse, the crickets suddenly silent, the air thick and heavy with a chill that seemed to follow me. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, gasping for breath as I tried to explain what I'd seen. My uncle just shook his head, looking at me with a grim expression. "You heard her too, then?" He told me about the legend, about the woman who'd supposedly drowned in the pond decades ago. Some said she'd been searching for her lost child. Others claimed she'd been trying to escape something, but no one knew for sure. Locals had reported hearing her voice on still nights. Her whispers carried on the wind, asking for help that never came. I didn't sleep that night, and the next day, I left the farm early, unable to shake the memory of her hollow eyes, her skeletal hands reaching out to me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice, faint and distant, calling to me from the edge of my dreams, whispering, "Help me." I can pinpoint the moment it all changed. We were at a dinner party with friends, a regular Saturday night full of laughter, wine, and easy conversation. He was his usual self, charming, attentive, always quick with a joke. But then I noticed something strange. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out with a grin, glancing down at the screen in a way that looked almost tender. I'd never seen him smile like that at his phone before, as if whoever was on the other end knew him in a way I didn't. When I asked who it was, he brushed me off quickly, saying it was just a work thing. He put his phone back in his pocket, but I felt a crack somewhere deep inside me, something small but undeniable. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He'd always been open with his phone, never minding if I glanced over at his screen or if he left it lying around. But now it was different. He'd take his phone with him everywhere, into the bathroom, the kitchen, even if he was just stepping outside for a minute. He'd position it face down on the table whenever we were together, only glancing at it when he thought I wasn't looking. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but a knot of anxiety started to grow in my stomach, a heavy, twisting feeling I couldn't ignore. Then he started coming home late. At first, it was a few extra hours here and there, nothing unusual. He said he was swamped with work, a big project that required late nights. I tried to be understanding, making his favorite meals, staying up late so I could see him when he got home. But each night, he'd come in later, and I'd smell a faint hint of perfume that wasn't mine, a sweetness that lingered in the air as he brushed past me with a quick kiss and a distracted good night. One Friday, he told me he'd be working late again, but something in his voice felt rehearsed, hollow. He didn't look me in the eye, and he left in a hurry, forgetting to say goodbye the way he always did. I sat there after he left, staring at the door, feeling the walls of our apartment close and around me. Something snapped inside, and I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and left, feeling the chill of the night air on my skin as I walked to his office building, a silent dread pounding in my chest. When I got there, I found an empty parking lot. The lights were off, and there was no sign of him or anyone else. I stood there, alone under the street lights, feeling the reality of it all crash down on me. I called his phone, and it rang and rang before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I went home, numb and hollow, curling up on the couch with my mind racing. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, couldn't turn off the images in my head of where he might be, who he might be with. The next day, he came home early, looking tired, his clothes rumpled. He greeted me with a sheepish smile, mumbling something about a long night and falling asleep at the office. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw the truth in his eyes, a flicker of guilt that he tried to hide. I asked him point blank if there was someone else. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice was shaky, and he avoided my gaze, fumbling for words. I could feel the lie in every syllable, each one driving the knife a little deeper. He finally admitted it. He told me he'd met her months ago, that they'd started out as friends, just talking, that he hadn't planned for things to get out of hand. It just happened, he said, as if betrayal were an accident, something he'd stumbled into rather than a choice he made every time he chose her over me. His words blurred together, and I felt myself growing cold, a numbness spreading through me as he tried to explain, to soften the blow. But there was nothing he could say to take away the ache, the raw pain that settled in my chest as I realized our life together had been nothing more than a shadow of what I thought it was. I asked him to leave. He begged me to understand, to forgive him, promising it was over, that he'd made a mistake. But I couldn't listen. I couldn't stand there, listening to his excuses, his pleas, knowing that he'd broken something inside me that could never be fixed. I watched him pack his things, each item a painful reminder of the life we'd shared, the trust he'd shattered with a few careless choices. In the days that followed, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of memories. Everywhere I looked, I saw him, his clothes in the closet, his favorite mug in the kitchen, our photos on the walls. I tried to go through the motions, to keep myself busy, but the weight of his absence felt unbearable, a constant reminder of the life I'd lost. Friends reached out, offering their support, but even their kindness felt distant, unable to touch the hollow ache inside me. But slowly, painfully, I started to heal. I cleaned out the apartment, putting away anything that reminded me of him, reclaiming the space as my own. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I'd forgotten about, things I used to love before him. I went on long walks, rediscovering parts of the city I'd once explored with him, but this time alone, finding peace in the solitude. Months later, he reached out, asking to meet. He said he wanted to apologize, to explain, to try to make things right. Part of me wanted to go, to hear him out, to understand why he'd done what he did. But I realized that I didn't need his explanations, his apologies. I'd found my own closure, my own way forward, and I didn't want to reopen old wounds. I ignored his message, letting it sit unanswered in my inbox. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over me, a calm acceptance that I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd loved him deeply, yes, but I loved myself more now, enough to know that I deserved better, that I deserved a love that was whole, honest, and true. And so, I moved on, leaving him and the heartbreak behind. I'm stronger now, more resilient, more sure of who I am and what I deserve. And one day, I'll find someone who sees that strength, who values it, who chooses me fully and without hesitation. Until then, I'm content, knowing that I've found something far more precious, my own self-worth. I've been working as a delivery driver for a few years. Nights and weekends mostly. It was boring, lonely work, but it paid well enough. The company had a route in a remote area outside of town, miles of open fields, winding forest roads, barely any cell service. Nobody wanted to work that route, but I took it. Figured I could listen to podcasts, maybe clear my head, but I'm never going back there again. It was a Friday night in late November, dark by the time I set out. The road was wet from a recent rain, fog hanging low and thick around the trees. The deliveries were for a handful of small farmhouses and one big, isolated mansion that was my last stop of the night. The mansion was old and half hidden by trees, barely visible from the road. I've been out there once before, but it looked completely different at night, eerie and deserted. I pulled up to the gate, which was half open, creaking in the wind, and drove down the long, gravel driveway. The house loomed up ahead, tall and silent, with only a single light in one of the upstairs windows. The rest of it was swallowed by darkness. I parked, grabbed the box, and got out, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off as just my nerves. I knocked on the door, waited a minute. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and after a moment, I heard footsteps, slow, shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I stepped back, waiting, but no one opened the door. Instead, I heard a voice, faint and raspy, coming from somewhere inside. Come in. It didn't sound right. The voice was hollow, almost mechanical, like it was playing from a tape recorder. But I told myself I was just imagining things and pushed open the door, stepping into a dimly lit hallway. The house smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floors creaked with every step I took. "Hello," I called out, holding the package under my arm. No answer, just a low hum of static coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to drop the package on the floor and go. But something made me stay. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe a weird sense of duty. So I stepped further into the house, calling out again, my voice barely above a whisper. The static grew louder as I moved down the hallway, leading me to a door at the end of the hall. I hesitated, then slowly opened it, peering inside. It was a study, lined with dusty shelves and old, faded books. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing an old television that was flickering with static. But what caught my eye was the table beside it, cluttered with old photos, dozens of them, scattered haphazardly. I walked over, drawn to the photos even though I felt that growing sense of dread. They were old, black and white, some faded beyond recognition. They showed people standing in front of the house, men, women, even a few children, all dressed in outdated clothes. But what sent a chill through me was that every single person had their face scratched out, gouged away with something sharp, leaving nothing but blank spaces where their eyes and mouths should have been. I backed away, my heart pounding, but then I noticed something on the far side of the table. A small mirror, its glass cloudy and cracked. It was angled slightly toward the door, and as I looked into it, I felt my blood turn to ice. I saw myself in the reflection, standing there in the dim light. But behind me, just over my shoulder, was a figure. A woman, her hair tangled and unkempt, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were wide, dark pits, empty, like she was staring right through me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. Nothing there but the quiet hum of the TV. I turned back to the mirror, but the woman was gone, leaving only my own wide-eyed reflection staring back at me. I didn't know what to think, didn't know if I was imagining things, if maybe I was just tired, or if this was some kind of sick prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. I backed out of the study, practically running down the hallway, my footsteps echoing. I reached the front door and stopped, my heart hammering as I realized I'd left the package behind. I was ready to leave it and go, but then I heard the voice again, that same hollow, mechanical voice coming from somewhere in the house. "You forgot something." I froze, every muscle tensing. It sounded closer now, coming from the end of the hallway where I'd just come from. I forced myself to turn, looking down the dark hall, but it was empty. Then I saw it. Just for a second, the faintest shadow slipping around the corner, disappearing into the darkness. I don't know what possessed me to follow, but I did, feeling that same, unshakable dread pull at me with every step. I turned the corner and found myself standing at the bottom of a staircase, leading up into the darkness. And there, halfway up the stairs, was the woman. She stood there, facing away from me, her hair falling over her shoulders, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, like her neck had been twisted too far. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and she swayed slightly, as though caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. "Are you coming?" she asked, her voice soft and distorted, like it was coming from far away. She took a slow step up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a strange compulsion that I couldn't understand. It was like the house itself was pulling me in, leading me deeper into its darkness. I took a step forward, then another, my hand trailing along the dusty railing as I climbed the stairs. The upstairs hallway was even darker, the walls lined with old, cracked photos. I kept my eyes on the floor, not daring to look at the faces in the frames. I could feel their eyes on me, could sense the weight of their stares, watching as I made my way down the hall. And at the end of the corridor was a door, slightly ajar, a faint light flickering from within. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, and froze. It was a bedroom, filled with a strange, musty smell that made my stomach turn. And in the center of the room was a bed, and lying on that bed was me. I stared, feeling a wave of cold wash over me. It was me, unmistakably, lying there with my eyes closed, my face pale, lips slightly parted as though I were sleeping. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was like looking into a mirror, but worse because the figure on the bed wasn't moving. It looked dead. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and I saw the woman standing there, her dark eyes fixed on me, a twisted smile on her face. "You're home now," she whispered, her voice soft and final, like a door slamming shut. I stumbled backward, turning and running down the hallway, down the stairs, out the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, practically throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. I sped down the driveway, gravel flying, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. When I got home that night, I locked every door, every window, sat in the center of my living room, and waited for the dawn. I quit the next morning, told my boss I'd never go back to that route again. He didn't argue, just gave me a strange look and said he understood. I've tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, a flicker of movement, like someone's watching me. And every time, I feel the chill of that house, hear the soft creak of the stairs, and remember the way my own lifeless face looked back at me. I still can't believe this happened. I don't expect anyone to believe it either, but maybe writing it out will help me make sense of it, or at least help me sleep again. I haven't slept a full night since that night in January, and I'm not sure I ever will. It started when I found a journal in an old box in my parents' attic. I'd been helping them clean out some stuff, and the journal was at the bottom of a box labeled Dad's college stuff. My dad had passed away a few years back, so the box had been sitting there untouched since then. I almost didn't open it. I'd seen all his old books and papers 100 times, but the journal caught my eye because it wasn't his handwriting. It was a black leather-bound book, worn and cracked, with no markings or names on it. I don't know what possessed me to flip it open, but the second I did, I couldn't put it down. The journal belonged to someone named Mark Dawson, written in the early 1980s. The entries were scattered, brief, but every one of them talked about the same thing: a woman who showed up in his dreams. A woman he described as beautiful but wrong, with hollow, dark eyes and a smile that seemed to know too much. She'd appeared in his dreams every night, following him, talking to him, sometimes whispering things that he couldn't remember when he woke up. It started as a curiosity for him. He'd call her the woman, but over the weeks, his writing became more erratic, desperate. He started saying she was no longer just in his dreams. He could see her out of the corner of his eye when he was awake, watching him from the shadows, smiling that same unsettling smile. I should have put the journal back, but something about it hooked me. I told myself it was just the ramblings of some college kid who probably spent too many nights in a row awake. But as I read further, his last few entries got even more disturbing. He wrote about her standing at the foot of his bed, touching his face, her fingers cold as ice. And then, in the final entry, scrawled in shaky handwriting, he wrote, "I finally understand. She's not in my dreams. I'm in hers." That night, I couldn't get her image out of my head. That idea that someone could be trapped in someone else's dream, that they could be a part of someone else's world, disturbed me in a way I couldn't shake. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, just as he described: hollow, black eyes, a smile that seemed to stretch a little too wide. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep, but it wasn't peaceful. I dreamed that I was walking through a dark forest, the air thick and cold, and I could feel someone watching me, following me just out of sight. I kept looking over my shoulder, catching glimpses of a shadowy figure slipping behind trees, her smile flashing in the darkness. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just the journal getting into my head. I put the book away and went about my day, but the dream haunted me. That night, I dreamed about her again, and this time, she was closer. She was standing at the edge of the forest, watching me, her eyes locked on mine, unblinking. When I woke up, I felt a strange, lingering chill on my skin, like the cold from the forest had followed me out of the dream. After a few nights, the dreams got worse. Every time, she'd be a little closer, her eyes never leaving mine, her smile growing a little wider. She never spoke, never moved, just stood there, watching, waiting. I started avoiding sleep, staying up as late as I could, but when I finally crashed, she was always there in the same forest waiting for me. One night, desperate to escape her, I tried something different. Instead of running from her in the dream, I stood my ground. I yelled, demanding to know who she was, what she wanted. And for the first time, she spoke. "You shouldn't have read his words," she said, her voice soft and cold, like a winter wind. "Now you're mine too." I woke up gasping, the room freezing cold even though the heater was on full blast. That's when I noticed it, a faint impression on my bedsheet, like someone had been lying next to me. The indent was still there, fresh, as if she'd only just left. After that night, I stopped sleeping altogether. I'd nap for a few minutes here and there, but every time I drifted off, I'd see her standing closer, her fingers reaching out, almost touching me. I could feel her presence when I was awake too, just behind me, just out of sight. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her reflection in a mirror, or see her shadow pass by in the corner of my eye. But when I turned, she was gone. I tried everything: burning sage, sleeping with lights on, even leaving the TV blaring through the night. Nothing worked. She was there, in my dreams and just beyond them, waiting. I could feel myself slipping, like she was draining me, pulling me further into her world, just like she had with Mark. Desperate, I went back to my parents' house to look for the journal, hoping maybe there'd be some clue, something that would tell me how to stop her. But when I opened the box, it was gone. I tore through every box in the attic, but it wasn't there. My mom said she hadn't seen it, and I knew I'd left it there. I started to feel like I was going crazy, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But every night, she was there, closer and closer, her fingers brushing my skin, colder each time. Then one night, she finally spoke again. "Come with me," she whispered, her voice as close as if she were right beside me. "You're already halfway here." I tried to scream, to wake myself up, but I was frozen, trapped in the dream with her. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing my face, and I felt myself slipping, like the ground was giving way beneath me, like she was pulling me under. I don't know how I got out of that dream, but when I woke up, I was on the floor, my body shaking, drenched in sweat. I looked in the mirror and saw scratches on my face, faint but unmistakable, like someone had dragged their nails down my cheek. I knew I couldn't go back to sleep, not with her waiting for me, but my body was exhausted, shutting down. I tried staying awake, filling my apartment with lights and noise, but it didn't matter. Whenever I closed my eyes, even for a second, I could feel her there, waiting. The worst part? I'm not even sure I'm awake anymore. Sometimes, I think I can still hear her voice, faint and distant, calling my name from the shadows. And every time I do, I feel that same cold touch brushing against my skin, pulling me closer, reminding me that I'm never truly alone. Maybe I'm still in her dream. It happened one winter night when I was house-sitting for my aunt. She'd asked me to stay over while she was on vacation, mainly to keep an eye on her temperamental old house. I didn't mind, I liked the place. It was an old, sprawling craftsman-style home with wood-paneled walls and a faint, comforting smell of cedar and dust that reminded me of my childhood. It was familiar and quiet, like stepping back in time. One night, after making a cup of tea, I was about to head upstairs when I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It was a faint, irregular hissing sound. I stopped, listening carefully, but it didn't repeat. I shrugged it off as the house, settling, and climbed the stairs to the guest room. But an hour later, as I lay in bed with a book, the sound came back, louder this time, and unmistakably coming from the basement. I felt a strange sense of dread settle over me, an instinctual unease that I couldn't quite ignore. My aunt had warned me that the boiler downstairs was ancient and finicky. She'd half-joked that it had a mind of its own, and that if it acted up, I should just turn it off and let it cool down. But she hadn't mentioned any hissing noises. Reluctantly, I got out of bed, grabbed my phone for a flashlight, and crept down the narrow stairs toward the basement door. I stood there for a moment, hesitating, listening. The hissing continued, steady and low, and I realized it wasn't just coming from the boiler. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere near the gas pipes. My heart rate picked up. I opened the door slowly, peering down into the dark, musty basement, every horror movie I'd ever seen running through my mind. But I forced myself to go down, taking one cautious step at a time, my phone's light barely cutting through the darkness. I reached the bottom and moved toward the boiler, following the sound to a small, copper gas pipe that was running along the wall. That's when I noticed it, a hairline crack in the pipe, hissing out a faint but steady stream of gas. The smell hit me then, sharp and acrid, unmistakable. I froze, realizing how dangerous this was. All it would take was one spark, one static discharge, and the entire basement could go up in flames. Keeping my breath shallow, I backed away slowly, fumbling for the stairs. I wanted to bolt up them, but I remembered something about how quick movements could sometimes cause sparks, so I forced myself to go slowly. As soon as I got to the top, I slammed the basement door, and opened every window in the house. I called the gas company, and they told me to leave the house immediately. I grabbed my coat and stood outside in the cold, my heart racing as I waited for them to arrive. When the technician finally pulled up, he was all business. He geared up, went inside, and was down in the basement for what felt like an eternity. I stood there on the porch, every possible what-if flashing through my mind. Finally, he came back up, shaking his head. "You did the right thing by calling," he said. "That pipe was on the verge of a serious leak. If you hadn't heard it, this could have been a disaster." He went on to explain that the crack had probably been there for a while, expanding gradually with the cold weather, and that even the tiniest spark could have set off an explosion. Standing there in the freezing night, I realized how close I'd come to a life-altering accident. If I hadn't been there to hear that faint hiss, if I'd ignored the sound and gone to bed, the leak could have filled the house by morning. It was terrifying, and it left me with a deep respect for how fragile our safety really is, how the smallest things can spiral into something unimaginable. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the awareness of how close I'd come to disaster. It made me think back on other moments where danger had crept up quietly, almost unnoticeable, until it was too late. Like the time I'd been cleaning my garage and nearly knocked over an old shelf packed with paint cans. One wrong move, and they could have fallen, spilling flammable chemicals everywhere. I started paying more attention to my surroundings after that night, seeing my home with a sharper eye. I went through every room, checking for frayed cords, testing smoke detectors, clearing clutter that could block an exit in an emergency. I even installed a carbon monoxide detector near the basement, something I hadn't thought about until I experienced that gas leak. The more I looked, the more I realized how many hidden risks lurked in plain sight, things I'd never considered because they were simply part of the house. I began noticing small details like the worn-out electrical outlets in my kitchen or the old, unreliable lock on my bathroom window. Each discovery felt like peeling back a layer of safety, revealing just how close we live to danger without ever realizing it. That experience changed me in a lasting way. I stopped taking the little things for granted. I started seeing my surroundings differently, with a cautious respect for the things that seemed mundane. It's easy to trust that the world around us is secure, that our homes are safe havens. But in reality, safety is something we create and maintain, not something we're guaranteed. Now, every time I walk by a gas line or flip a light switch, I remember that night in my aunt's basement, the faint hiss of gas that could have changed everything. And I remind myself to stay aware, to listen for the subtle warnings, because sometimes it's the quietest sounds that have the most urgent messages. I never believed in the supernatural, in ghosts or curses or anything like that. I'm an EMT, and you see a lot of grim things in this line of work. You get used to rational explanations, to handling fear and chaos with a level head. But last winter, something happened on a call that I can't explain, something I don't talk about with anyone, because I'm not sure they believe me. I don't think I would either if I hadn't seen it myself. It was around 2 a.m, the dead of winter. My partner, Rachel, and I were in the ambulance, parked in a lot between calls, trying to grab a few minutes of rest. It was freezing, the kind of cold that cuts right through you, even with the heat blasting. The streets were empty, just a few flurries swirling under the streetlights. Then the call came in, a woman down in an old part of town, the kind of area where every other building is abandoned. Dispatch was vague, just that she'd called from a payphone, barely coherent, saying she needed help. Something about her voice had rattled the dispatcher. I could tell from the tension in his voice when he radioed us in. We pulled up to the address, an old, dilapidated apartment building with boarded-up windows, the kind of place where squatters sometimes broke in to get out of the cold. I'd been on calls like this before, usually addicts or homeless folks who needed medical attention but didn't want to go to the hospital. I didn't think too much of it as Rachel and I grabbed our gear and headed to the door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of rot and mold. The building was pitch dark, the only light coming from the narrow beams of our flashlights. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the floor was littered with broken glass and scraps of old furniture. We called out, announcing ourselves, but there was no response, just the echo of our voices bouncing off the empty walls. Rachel spotted a door slightly ajar down the hall, and we headed toward it. As we got closer, I noticed something odd, scratch marks on the door frame, like someone had clawed at it, desperate to get in or out. The wood was splintered, jagged in places. I remember glancing at Rachel, but neither of us said anything. We were both thinking the same thing. Get in, get the patient, get out. When we stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The room was empty except for a woman sitting on the floor, her back against the far wall, knees pulled up to her chest. She was shivering, her clothes soaked through and torn, her hair tangled and matted. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring off into the distance, like she didn't even see us. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, soothing. But she didn't respond. She just kept staring, her mouth slightly open, her lips cracked and blue from the cold. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight on her face, and that's when I noticed her hands. They were covered in cuts, deep scratches running down her arms, like she'd been clawing at something, tearing her own skin apart. I crouched down next to her, trying to get her attention, but she was unresponsive. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak. Rachel and I exchanged a look, and I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. We needed to get her to the hospital, but something was wrong. The room felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on us, thick and stifling. As we prepared to move her, she suddenly turned her head, looking straight at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of cold run down my spine. Her mouth moved, forming words barely audible, like a whisper just on the edge of hearing. "Don't let him in." Her voice was cracked, hollow, filled with a kind of dread that I'd never heard before. I tried to ask her who she meant, but she just repeated it, her voice growing weaker with each word. "Don't let him in. Don't let him in." Then, without warning, her eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward, unconscious. I felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion, like we'd dodged some invisible threat. Rachel and I moved quickly, getting her onto the stretcher, strapping her in, and wheeling her back to the ambulance. Once we were inside, the tension seemed to lift a little. I took the driver's seat while Rachel monitored her in the back, and we started down the winding road back to the hospital. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, convincing myself it was just the creepy atmosphere, the cold, the darkness. But then, as we were driving down a long stretch of empty road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, a faint, flickering shape that seemed to move in and out of the darkness, keeping pace with us. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was still there. It was a figure, tall and thin, walking down the middle of the road, its head bent at an unnatural angle, its arms hanging limply at its sides. It was too far away for me to make out any details, but there was something wrong about the way it moved, jerky and disjointed, like it was being pulled along by invisible strings. I tried to focus on the road, but my eyes kept flicking to the mirror, watching as the figure grew closer, moving faster than any person should be able to, its dark shape looming larger with each second. I could feel my pulse racing, my hands gripping the wheel, so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then Rachel's voice came over the radio, tense and scared. "Do you see that?" I didn't have to ask what she meant. I could hear the fear in her voice, the same dread that was clawing at my insides. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, keeping my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the figure in the mirror. "We're almost there," I said, more for my own reassurance than anything else. But as I said it, the woman on the stretcher began to stir, her body twitching, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, her gaze frantic, wild, like an animal trapped in a cage. She started mumbling, her voice weak and panicked, repeating the same phrase over and over again. He's here, he's coming." Rachel tried to calm her down, but the woman's panic only grew, her voice rising to a terrified scream. I glanced in the mirror, and that's when I saw it. The figure was right behind us, its face just inches from the back window, staring straight at me. Its eyes were empty, dark pits, its mouth twisted into a horrible, unnatural grin. The woman's screams filled the ambulance, echoing in the confined space, mixing with the sound of my own panicked breathing. I floored the gas, speeding down the road, desperate to reach the hospital, to escape whatever was chasing us. But the figure stayed with us, its face pressed against the glass, watching, waiting. We finally reached the hospital, screeching to a stop in front of the emergency entrance. I jumped out of the ambulance, throwing open the back doors, but when I looked at the rear window, the figure was gone. We rushed the woman inside, barely taking a breath until we were safe in the bright, sterile light of the ER. But as we handed her over to the doctors, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Her eyes were wide, staring at me with a kind of pleading desperation. "He'll follow you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always follows." That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night over and over in my mind. I wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion, fear. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that twisted grin, those empty eyes. And now, weeks later, I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I'm walking to my car after a shift, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow just beyond the streetlights, a tall, thin figure lurking at the edge of my vision. I tell myself it's nothing, that it's all in my head, but deep down, I know he's still there, waiting. And I know that no matter where I go, he'll follow. I don't know how to explain what happened, and honestly, part of me is scared to even try. But it's been eating away at me like it's crawling under my skin, and maybe putting it into words will help me understand, or at least keep me from losing my mind. A couple of months ago, I took a part-time job helping clean out an old estate. It was just a temporary thing while I looked for something better, and the pay was decent. The house was massive, this old Victorian place in the middle of nowhere, half swallowed by the forest around it. The owner, Mrs. Harlow, was a sweet, elderly woman who seemed a little off. But I chalked it up to age and living alone in a house that felt like it was holding its breath. She hired me to clear out the attic. "It's just old junk up there, things left by the previous owners," she said. "No need to worry about what you find. Just toss it out." She'd been renting the place out for years, so I figured it would be mostly old furniture, dusty boxes, maybe some creepy family portraits. I didn't expect much. The first day I went up there, I was hit with this overpowering smell like mildew mixed with something rotting. The attic was dark, cluttered with piles of boxes and old furniture stacked haphazardly. It was almost like no one had touched a thing in years. I found an old lamp in one corner, wiped off the dust, and plugged it in, filling the space with this weak, sickly light that barely seemed to cut through the shadows. I spent hours sorting through boxes, separating what could be donated from what was clearly trash. Most of it was harmless. Old books, broken knickknacks, faded clothes. But as the sun started to go down, I noticed something strange. Tucked away behind an old wardrobe, almost hidden, was a small wooden box, locked with a thick, tarnished brass latch. Something about it caught my eye. It was simple, but the wood was dark, almost black, with strange, barely visible symbols carved along the edges. I don't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out of place, like it didn't belong there. I should have just left it, but curiosity got the better of me. I brought the box downstairs and asked Mrs. Harlow if she knew anything about it. She took one look and went pale, her hands trembling as she held the box. "Put that back," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That box stays in the attic. It's not supposed to leave." I laughed, thinking she was just being superstitious, but she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me," she said, her eyes wide. "Whatever's in that box, it isn't meant to see the light of day. Leave it alone." Her reaction was enough to spook me, so I took it back up and tucked it back behind the wardrobe, telling myself it was just an old box, probably full of useless junk. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it, like it was calling to me, begging me to open it. The next day, I went back up to the attic, determined to ignore it. I spent hours packing up more boxes, trying to keep my focus on the task, but every few minutes, my eyes would drift back to that wardrobe. By the time the sun set, I couldn't resist anymore. I moved the wardrobe, pulled out the box, and examined the lock. It was old, rusted, but I found a small screwdriver and managed to pry it open. The latch gave with a loud, echoing snap that made my skin crawl. I felt this strange, suffocating pressure, like the air itself was holding its breath. I opened the lid slowly, my heart pounding, and looked inside. The box was lined with black velvet, and nestled in the center was a small, yellowed envelope. That was it. Nothing else. I pulled out the envelope, the paper brittle and thin, and opened it. Inside was a single slip of paper, folded into quarters, covered in cramped, scrawling handwriting that was barely legible. It looked like someone had written it in a hurry, the letters uneven, jagged. The message was short. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Don't let it see you. Don't let it in. You can't get rid of it now. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was some kind of prank, maybe left by the previous owners to scare someone like me. But as I refold the paper, I noticed something else, a faint, dark smudge on the edge of the note. It looked like a fingerprint, but it was deep red like dried blood. That was enough for me. I shoved the note back in the envelope, closed the box, and put it back where I found it, telling myself that was the end of it. But as I left the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me just out of sight. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something creaking. My first thought was that it was just the old house settling, but as I lay there, straining to listen, I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving across the floorboards outside my door. I held my breath, listening, and then silence. Just as I started to relax, there was a slow, heavy knock on my door. 3 taps, steady and measured, like someone was standing just on the other side, waiting for me to answer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe, praying that it was just my imagination. But then the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. And then, without warning, the handle began to turn slowly, like someone was testing it, trying to get inside. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The handle turned all the way. The door creaked open an inch, and then silence. Nothing happened. The handle stayed still, the door ajar, but no one stepped inside. I waited, paralyzed, for what felt like hours, until finally, the door closed with a soft click. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, listening to every creak, every gust of wind, terrified that whatever was outside my door would come back. By morning, I convinced myself it was just a nightmare, some trick of the mind, a product of my overactive imagination. But then, as I was getting dressed, I noticed something strange. There, on the inside of my door, was a dark, hand-shaped smudge, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had pressed their palm against the wood, leaving behind a red, almost bloody stain. That was enough. I packed up my things and left the house, telling Mrs. Harlow I couldn't finish the job. She looked at me with a strange sadness in her eyes, like she'd been expecting it. "I told you not to touch that box," she whispered, but I was already halfway out the door, too scared to look back. Since then, things haven't been the same. I keep hearing those same slow, deliberate footsteps, sometimes outside my apartment, sometimes just behind me in an empty room. I've tried everything to get rid of that feeling. The sage, the prayers, even moving across town. But every night, I still hear those knocks on my door, steady and patient, like it's waiting for me to let it in. And sometimes, when I finally build up the courage to open the door, I find it, a faint, hand-shaped smudge on the wood, darker each time, as if it's getting closer, waiting just on the other side, biding its time. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what I let out of that box. But whatever it is, I can feel it getting closer. And I'm terrified that one night, I'll open the door and it'll finally be there, waiting. It was about midnight when I got the call from my uncle's lawyer. I'd just come back from a long shift, kicked off my shoes, and was halfway through reheating leftovers when my phone buzzed. I didn't even recognize the number, but answered out of habit. "Is this Thomas?" came a calm, professional voice. "Yeah, this is Thomas," I replied, already bracing myself for some kind of sales pitch. "My name is George Carver, your uncle's attorney," he said. "I have some important documents related to his estate, and I'd like to arrange a time for you to pick them up." I paused, thrown. My Uncle Henry had passed away over a year ago. We'd all grieved and moved on, as best we could. Henry was a quiet man, eccentric but kind, who'd spent most of his life restoring antiques and never seemed too concerned with the affairs of his family. My dad's older brother, Henry, had always been more of a mystery than anything. But we'd packed up his things, settled his estate, and I'd thought that chapter was closed. Sorry, but did something get left out? We thought everything was handled, I said, unsure if this was some kind of scam. That's correct. I've only recently been instructed to contact you, the lawyer replied, his tone unwavering. Your uncle left specific instructions for this item to be delivered exactly 1 year after his passing, and he specified you as the recipient. Me? I repeated, feeling a strange chill. Yes, it's a personal item he wanted you to have. He gave me an address, a small office downtown. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the past stay in the past, but curiosity got the better of me. The next day, I found myself in a small, cluttered office that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. Mr. Carver was an older man, with silver hair and a worn suit, the kind of guy who probably lived and breathed paperwork. He motioned for me to sit, reaching behind his desk and producing a package wrapped in brown paper. This is it, he said, sliding the package across the desk. Your uncle was adamant that this be given to you specifically. He made me promise. I took the package, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than I'd expected, like something substantial was inside. I nodded at Mr. Carver, thanked him, and made my way back to my car, the package resting in my lap like a secret. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was an old, leather-bound journal, its cover scuffed and worn, with Henry's initials etched into the corner. I opened it, my fingers trembling slightly. On the first page was a note, written in my uncle's familiar handwriting. To Thomas, my nephew and friend, you've always had a curious spirit like mine. I hope this finds you well and leads you somewhere you haven't yet gone. I turned the page, and the entries began. The journal wasn't just a record of Henry's thoughts. It was a roadmap of his life, filled with sketches, notes, and cryptic clues. He described places he'd visited, strange objects he'd collected, people he'd met. But what caught my eye were the sketches. Drawings of an old, abandoned house deep in the woods, a place he called the Sanctuary. As I read on, it became clear that Henry had spent years searching for this house, chasing whispers of its existence from one lead to another. There were descriptions of dusty maps he'd found in antique shops, snippets of conversations he'd had with people who claimed to know where it was. He'd written with an obsession, detailing every lead, every dead end. My curiosity grew with each page. There was something about his words, the mystery of it all, that pulled me in. I felt like I was stepping into his world, seeing the world through his eyes. Near the end of the journal, one entry stood out. It was dated just a few months before he'd passed away. Finally found it, he'd written, the words underlined. It's real, more incredible than I ever imagined. The sanctuary isn't just a house, it's something else, something timeless. But he didn't say much more. The entry stopped abruptly, as if he'd intended to come back and finish his thoughts, but never got the chance. For days, I couldn't get the journal out of my mind. The mystery of the sanctuary gnawed at me. Why had Henry left this for me? And what had he meant about it being timeless? I felt like he'd given me a puzzle, a challenge that only I could solve. And so, on a quiet Saturday morning, I decided to try and find it. I packed a small bag, grabbed the journal, and set off in my car, driving to the remote area where Henry had hinted the sanctuary might be. The directions in the journal were vague at best, filled with landmarks that might not even exist anymore. But somehow, with every mile, I felt closer to him, like I was carrying on a journey he'd left unfinished. I drove for hours, finally reaching a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. I parked and continued on foot. The journal opened to a page with a rough sketch of the area. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the world around me was quiet, as though holding its breath. After what felt like miles of walking, I saw it. Just like Henry had described, a house, weathered and ancient, hidden in a small clearing. Its roof was sagging, and ivy covered most of the walls, but it was unmistakably the sanctuary. My heart raced as I approached, each step feeling heavier, like the air around the house was denser, charged with something unseen. I pushed open the door, which creaked ominously, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the cracks in the walls. The furniture was covered in dust, and old paintings hung crooked on the walls. There was a feeling of timelessness here, like the place was frozen, caught in some in-between state. I wandered through the rooms, taking in the strange objects scattered around. A brass telescope, an ancient globe, a faded photograph of a young couple standing by a lake. And then, in the corner of the main room, I spotted something that made my breath catch. It was a small chest, just like the one Henry had sketched in the journal, marked with a familiar symbol, a compass rose engraved on the lid. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, was an hourglass. It was beautiful, crafted from brass and glass, the sand inside a shimmering silver. But there was something odd about it. The sand wasn't falling. It stayed suspended, as if frozen in time. I picked it up, feeling a strange energy pulsing from it, and as I held it, I noticed an inscription on the base. For those who seek to find. I couldn't explain it, but holding the hourglass felt like I'd stepped out of my own life and into something larger. Henry had spent his life searching for this, and now, somehow, he'd passed it on to me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the hourglass, feeling as though I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. When I finally left the house, the hourglass carefully packed in my bag, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though Henry was with me, his journey complete. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what the sanctuary was or why Henry had been so drawn to it, but I knew one thing. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be experienced, to be carried with us like whispers, reminders of the parts of life that remain unexplained. And now, whenever I look at the hourglass on my shelf, the silver sand frozen in place, I feel that mystery, that timelessness, and I remember that the journey doesn't end with answers. Sometimes it's enough just to follow where the compass leads,